On behalf of the University of Miami, welcome to the 2019 Real Estate Impact Conference. My name is Chuck Bohl. I'm the director of the Masters in Real Estate Development and Urbanism based at the School of Architecture. I had the honor of chairing this year's Impact Conference, and it was another tremendous collaborative team effort between the School of Architecture, the Miami Business School, and help from our friends at the law school. I want to take a moment to thank and recognize the Impact Conference team. It takes a lot of people to organize and deliver this event, and you met many of our team members when you arrived and checked in today. I can't tell you how hard they worked the many months in advance of this event and many, many hours this week leading up to the event. Please join me in saying thank you to our great Canes team. Our board members are also instrumental in shaping the program and creating an engaging event. Thank you to our steering committee members from the MRED and the Business Real Estate Advisory Boards, Doug Bowen, Michael Comras, Manny DiZaraga, Vanessa Grout, Arnaud Cosenti, Matthew Lazenby, and John Sumberg. This group represents the very best of the strong partnership between our schools to advance real estate education at the U, and they were also a pleasure to work with. Thank you all. I'd like to take a moment to recognize the leadership of our advisory boards in architecture, business, and law. We have with us today Steve Witkoff, who will join us in a moment, serves as the chair of the Real Estate Advisory Board for the Miami Business School. Gary Saul serves as chair of the advisory board for the Real Property Development Program based in the law school. And today, John Sumberg is completing an outstanding 2-year run as chair of the MRED Advisory Board. John is turning over the helm to Nitin Motwani, the managing principal of Miami World Center, and we're excited to welcome him as our incoming chair. We want to thank John for his strong leadership and continued service to our advisory board. Thank you, John. Ten years ago this fall, 11 founding board members of the MRED program first convened. Today, under the leadership of John, Steve, and Gary, and their predecessors, there are nearly 100 industry leaders serving on real estate advisory boards in support of programs in architecture, business, and law. Our programs have blossomed through your involvement and support, and today we're attracting greater interest and stronger applicants than ever before. You've helped us to differentiate ourselves from our peers and compete to bring the best and the brightest, I see you right there, in South Florida. I'll close by highlighting 3 things that I think have set us apart from our peers. The first is our location. As one of the world's most dynamic markets and exciting regions, South Florida represents an extraordinary setting for the study of all manner of real estate investment and development, of cutting-edge architecture and design, and prodigious accomplishments in construction and engineering. We are literally the place to be for the study of real estate. The second is our university-wide interdisciplinary strength. The University of Miami is extremely unique in offering undergraduate and graduate programs in every field connected to the real estate industry under one roof. Real estate development, construction management, architecture, and urban design within the School of Architecture, an undergraduate real estate major, an MBA concentration in real estate, and an accelerated MBA in real estate in the Miami Business School, and one of the oldest LLM degrees in the nation dedicated to the study of real property development in the law school. In terms of real estate development, the U is an interdisciplinary powerhouse. And in contrast to our peers, we operate as partners, not as silos. UM provides a rich interdisciplinary experience for our students that mirrors the real-world relationships between our disciplines and professions. Our students share courses, they collaborate on team projects and competitions, they form partnerships and companies after graduating, and occasionally they even get married to one another and have children, building the UM family. Third, and most importantly, we are supported by all of you, by our board members, but also by the incredible community of talented professionals in South Florida. In addition to your sponsorship of this conference, many of you are directly engaged in the education of our students. In our classrooms and speaker series, through our mentorship programs and networking events, through organizing tours of your projects, through sponsored studios and sites for their team projects and capstone workshops, through internships where they gain valuable work experience, and ultimately through your hiring of our graduates, many of whom are here today as alumni. Through all your efforts, you are shaping the next generation of visionaries, problem solvers, and industry leaders. And together, we are helping our students acquire the knowledge to address the most vexing challenges of our time and fueling the creativity and technical skills for them to build livable, resilient communities. On behalf of our students and alumni, thank you for your time, your service, and your commitment to their success. It's now my pleasure to introduce one of the key people who have been with us from the beginning and who has played a leading role in shaping the Impact Conference and supporting real estate education at the U. Steve Witkoff is the iconic chairman and CEO of Witkoff, which he founded in 1997. One part developer, one part investor, one part game changer. Steve is a true heavyweight who operates in the most intensive central business districts in the US and abroad with an extraordinary track record punctuated by his work in New York City. Steve leads a full-service firm with extensive expertise in all aspects of the development process, from financing and acquisitions through construction. In reviewing his work, again, I was struck by the sheer diversity of his projects, which encompass virtually every real estate sector. Everything from high-rise Wall Street office buildings to the Edition luxury hotel in Times Square, to an extraordinary rehab and repositioning of the historic Woolworth building in Manhattan, and the largest single collection of cast iron buildings in Soho. It's an amazing record of achievement. Please join me in welcoming a great friend of the University of Miami, Steve Witkoff, Chair of the Miami Business School's Real Estate Advisory Board.
Thank you, Charles. That's really kind words. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Steve Witkoff. I am the CEO of the Witkoff Group, and I am the chair of the Miami Business School Real Estate Advisory Board. Welcome, everybody, to the 2019 edition of the University of Miami's Real Estate Impact Conference. You can tell by the size of the crowd that we have another exceptional program this year. Looking out over this sea of faces makes me think that if I could, it's in scarce supply in this market, I should build a hotel with a bigger ballroom just for this conference. One of the great joys, my great joys of this conference is the fact that the audience, and now the overflow room, is full of students and alums from the University of Miami's real estate programs. I had two children myself who went to the University of Miami Business School. Let me ask for a show of hands, please, from all of the alums in the audience, so everyone can recognize them, please. That's great. And my favorite, a show of hands from the students who are joining us here today. So, everybody who runs a business, take a look at these students. They're eager, they're tech savvy, they're incredibly well-educated millennials. Talk to them at the breaks, hire them. They are the future of our real estate industry. I want to thank all of the many generous sponsors of this conference listed in the center section of the program. It is through your support that we're able to put on a conference of this significance. It is an impressive group, and in addition to those listed, I want to thank Cadena Partners and as well my very dear friend Kobe Karp and Nancy from Karp Associates for their support. And then a special thank you to one of my closest friends, Howard Lorber. Howard is a presenting sponsor. He's been that way since the beginning. He is the CEO of the Vector Group and Douglas Elliman, and he has been involved in this conference since its inception. Howard could not be with us today, but he sends his congratulations to everybody on another great event. Now I would like to introduce John Kislak. John is the managing partner of Antares Capital Corporation, and he is the son of the late Jay Kislak. As those of you who have been with us at previous conferences know, Jay was the one who planted the seed for the very first Impact Conference by agreeing to become the first presenting sponsor. Look what that seed has grown into. I also want to tell John a small story about his dad, because his dad had an enormous impact on my career. His father had a company by the name of J.I. Kislak, and I was a young associate at Dreyer & Traub, which was a boutique real estate investment firm. I was representing a who's who of developers, including today's President of the United States. And J.I. Kislak was processing Freddie Mac loans. And I called someone from that company, asked what it would take for me to buy a building in the Bronx, by the way, around the block from where I was originally born. Got all the data from J.I. Kislak, and that became my first building. So I told Jay that when I first met him years ago, and I just related the story to John, and I wanted everybody in the audience to hear. Jay was a legend, and he was a formative presence in the lives of people like me. So with that, I introduce you to John.
Thank you, and the Kislak Foundation is again pleased to be a presenting sponsor of this. It was always very close to my father's heart, and thank you for that story. I just want to take the opportunity for all the young people in the room to think about that, to think about how, without knowing about it, without thinking about it, how your behavior will make a difference in somebody else's life that you might not know about for a decade or maybe even forever. I frankly had never heard that story until today, so thank you for sharing it. In 1953, my mother and father moved to Miami with me and my little brother in tow. We lived in a two-story apartment house. Two-story was tall in those days down here. A two-story apartment house on Belle Island on Venetian Causeway. My father took the jitney across Venetian Causeway downtown to the Plaza Building. Cost 5 cents to get to work. After the Plaza Building, which was brand new at that point, we moved to 1220 Biscayne and then to 1101 Brickell right up the block and ultimately out to Miami Lakes. Also by rumor, and I don't know if it's true, in 1953, the University of Miami required female applicants to include a photograph in their applications to see if they were worthy of admission to the University of Miami. So what's changed since 1953? I'm not going there. The apartment house that we lived in is now gone. It's a high-rise. It's across the street from the Standard, so it's very cool, probably much cooler than we would have been when we were there. The Plaza office building is still there in downtown Miami, but I assume somebody out here has an option on it, is figuring out how to redevelop it. If not, it's time. It's almost 70 years old. The Brickell Avenue, the 11-story building we moved into, was the tallest building on Brickell, and Brickell at that time was all the stately mansions up and down the street that look sort of like South Miami Avenue looks today, and of course that's changed. 1220 Biscayne is now part of the Art Center, and Miami Lakes is no longer the Graham family dairy. There's a lot of other stuff going on. My father watched the community change and participated in a lot of it in financing, a lot of it as an equity partner, a lot of land banking along Brickell Avenue, even some developing as a principal, and always found it exciting. He also required all employees to spend some time off campus at some time during the year, every year, to get some outside education, to learn what was going on somewhere else, to find out what other people were thinking about, to understand the rest of the world. So this conference fuses two things that were very important to him. One is his love of Miami, and two is his love of learning. And he would be pleased to see the crowd here today. A quick additional note. That was his business. His passion was collecting. He collected books, started almost as soon as we got to Miami. He collected old books and new books about early Florida. He collected maps. He collected manuscripts. He collected artifacts. He collected things about the Spanish conquest. He collected pre-Columbian artifacts and items, and amassed quite a collection. 4,000 or so of the items that he collected are now in the Kislak wing at the Library of Congress in Washington, and most of the rest of them are at the Freedom Tower at Miami-Dade College and at the U at the University of Miami. And that was his passion and that was his love. So now a short tribute to my father, which was put together by the university. Thank you for doing it. It features Harv Mogul, who was head of the United Way of Miami for over a quarter of a century, and by Leonard Abbas, the former owner of City National Bank, and any of you who've been down here long enough borrowed from him at some point or other.
I've met a lot of really great people, but Jay stands out as probably the most unique philanthropist, contributor, civic leader I've ever met.
He was somebody who, after you spent time with him, you felt you were a lot smarter than when you walked in the room.
Jay was the kind of guy who was the example. He was the kind of guy that you wanted to be when you grew up, if you could possibly be like that.
I think I admired the way he went about doing the amazing things that he did. And I don't know how wide the story is known about his accomplishments, but if Jay set out to do something, it got done, and it got done probably better than anybody else could do it.
He was involved in so many charitable enterprises and civic enterprises that you never knew exactly where he might come from. It might be a United Way meeting, and the next thing you know, he's talking about the University of Miami or Miami-Dade College, or we're talking about Temple Bethel. He's with equal passion. It wasn't just what it did for him in terms of actualizing his own dreams, but his dream was how he could help connect all of us to our roots.
I was fascinated how Jay spent a lifetime acquiring and giving away these incredible, important documents and works that document our history. I did go to the Library of Congress specifically to see what he had donated there. And, you know, in Jay's sense of humor, I called him from there. And I said, I'm here, Jay, this is unbelievable. And you got more space than Jefferson for his library. And he says, yeah, but they paid Jefferson, I had to pay them.
People were always surprised at him. They made assumptions about what he would be like, and he always blew them away. His strength, his intellect, his curiosity, standing in front of people, accepting an award, thanking someone for doing something, was always a fun time for me, because Jay surprised people.
You know, I think Jay led by example, by being who he was, a man who led a good life, who did extremely well and gave back to everybody else.
His treasure that he gave was so much more than his money, so much more than his intellect, it's so much more than his time. It was a combination of those three things and so much more. And Jay was just fundamentally important to Miami.
Thank you. He would have wanted to be here today, except for that, he'd have been truly embarrassed. But thank you very much. So one of the important people who helped Kislak over the years and helped build the community, the business community in this town, was a guy named Doc Hughes. I am sure Doc Hughes had a first name, but I don't know what it was. And now his daughter, Doc Hughes, I do know her first name is Andrea.
I would like to thank everybody for coming here today and for all of your generous support of our real estate programs. While our guests for the first session get settled, I want to take just 60 seconds to tell you a little bit about a couple new initiatives we have in the Miami Business School. We have a specialized Master's of Science in Finance and Real Estate Investment because we know how important capital is to all of the exciting ventures that you have going on here. You will find a flyer in your envelope, as well as a flyer about some very generous financial support, both from the Witkoff Endowment and from the Butters Family Endowment. And lastly, I have to confess, we are a business school. We do make a little bit of money on this conference, as you can imagine by the list of sponsors and the number of people that are here. And there are two initiatives that we are highlighting this year to give back to the community. We have an impact investing in commercial real estate competition, and I'm pleased to announce that we have 5 finalists for this year. And I bet when I tell you the schools that we'll hit a lot of people in the audience. The 5 finalists are FIU, George Washington, the University of Miami, USC, and Wharton. And April 5th will be the final judging of those winners for those projects. So stay tuned and see whether your university won. Also, this summer, we will host about 30 academically advanced but economically disadvantaged students in a program called Nexus. High school students will come and spend 2 weeks at UM to learn some life skills, some college prep, and to learn about the commercial real estate industry and to work on a socially beneficial project. So we do use your resources to give back. Now, without further ado, I can talk because the people to my left need no introduction. I will turn it over to great friends, business partners, Hamid Moghadam and Armando Cadena. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Are you ready for this?
I'm born ready.
So, I guess since you're in my turf, I should welcome you to Miami first of all.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Right. So, I want the audience to know that Hamid left his home in San Francisco January 22nd, hasn't been back yet. And he flew from Brazil to here last night to join you. So we appreciate your being here very much.
Great to be here.
It's hard for me to know where to start with you other than to tell you this is another fine mess you got me into. I'm only here because of you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a good story, but you all know it's not true.
No, it happens to be true. I tell you exactly how it happened. I got a call from Manny de Sarraga who said, oh, we would really love to have Hamid speak, and we know you're close. We want the both of you. I think they really wanted you. So I was kind of like So Manny is a good friend, and I didn't want to say no. So I told Manny, write me an email with exactly what you want, and I'll forward it to Hamid. And I forwarded to Hamid, convinced that Hamid was going to say no, can't do it. So then I look good with Manny, but Hamid gets the email, and I made the mistake of including Manny, and he writes back, I'll do it if you do it. That's how we got into this mess. I live here. I've never been to one of these. You come from Brazil, so we've been friends and partners for 20-some years. We've never had an argument. My admiration for Hamid is boundless. I've had the fortune of meeting the business elite on this country. Hamid certainly is one, but he's a total package in terms of family values, friendship. So we have remained close for 20-some years. So Hamid, I had David Losky, who's very involved with this real estate conference, in my office a couple of days ago. I said, what do we do? And he gave me good advice. He said, I think people want to know about your history, not mine particularly, but yours. What your view of the market is, and what advice do you have for students? So let me go with a couple of questions first. So you started your business in 1983.
That's right.
By 1990, you were a large fund manager, right? And in 97, you went public.
That's right.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about that evolution, and tell them where the name A&B came from.
Sure. First of all, it's great to be here, and those of you who know Armando is that you can't say no to him. So when he sent the email, that's why I'm here, just to be clear about that. It's a long time. It's been almost 36 years since we started the business. You know, I started the business with two partners, Doug Abbey and Bob Burke, hence A&B, the initials of the three founders. Not very creative. But we started the business in San Francisco, and we had no money. I mean, literally. We went to Crocker Bank and borrowed $50,000 line of credit and got into the advisory business of helping owners of real estate who had distress. For those of you who are older, you remember that 1983 was kind of a tough market. And we sort of earned a reputation in being guys that were good at turnarounds, and we leveraged that into sponsoring our first fund, which was the great sum of $100 million, which it took us about a year to raise the first 10. And we stumbled over the finish line at 70 and called it a victory in 1988. And we're investing that money in neighborhood shopping centers and industrial properties. And you all may remember that office buildings went through a really bad cycle at that time. The S&L crisis happened, and our investments in retail and industrial kept on performing. I mean, these were things that those days you could buy at 10 cap and good yields and good appreciation. So by the time we got to 1990 and we're going out to raise our second fund, we were targeting 200 million bucks. And within 2 or 3 months, we raised 400. And the business really started growing from there. And kind of between then and the time we went public in 1997, we were able to grow the business through a combination of funds and separate accounts with institutional investors to about $5 billion of assets under management, a third neighborhood shopping centers and 2/3 industrial. And in 1995, I met Armando for the first time because the first project that we bought from Codina was Beacon Industrial Park out west, and we've done a lot of things together over the years. So that's 20 years of it anyway in 2 minutes.
So I want the audience to know that I knew this story, but the next question that I'm going to ask him, I think it's something I should have asked him before but haven't. So when I met you around that time, I remember you and I had a conversation where you said to me that you were in the process of getting rid of all of your retail and you were going to be a pure industrial, which, since we were talking about taking potential units, so I like the idea of a single play, but when you look back now, that's got to be one of the best strategic decisions anyone that I've met with made. You got rid of all the retail and you concentrated on industrial, not only industrial, but gateway cities and close to port and airports. So what made you this? How did that happen?
So that's an interesting question. How many of you remember a company called Webvan? Yeah, they were the original online grocer that was going to deliver product to your homes. And this was in the days of pretty much dial-up internet. DSL was really fast in those days. And the gentleman that started the company was a man by the name of Louis Borders, who started Borders Books and sold it to Kmart later. So this was his second entrepreneurial gig. And I met him and had a 2-hour conversation with him about online and e-commerce. And it really made an impression on me, and sort of started thinking about what the implications of that would be in terms of both retail and industrial. And because of that, we kind of decided that we're going to do 2 things. We're going to get rid of actually 3 things. We're going to get rid of our retail properties, and we sold about $1 billion and change of retail to I think it was CalPERS and other REIT. The second thing is that we're going to take our industrial, which was probably over 30 markets around the country. At that time, we were only domestic, and to focus it on the top 12 cities where there were major population centers and locations for a massive consumption, including Miami. And the third thing we did, which wasn't so smart, is that we put $5 million of venture capital in the first round of Webvan. And of course, that company ended up raising literally hundreds of millions of dollars, expanded in 10 or 12 different locations, and went public for a little while, had a market value of a couple of $1 billion, and then went to zero. So, but the important thing is that prompted us to really think hard about retail and ultimately decide to dispose of our portfolio a year or two later. But if you think that's a really smart strategic thing, Armando, at the time we could have invested in Amazon, which was at that time a bookseller. And if we had invested in Amazon the same $5 million, we would be sitting here with $5 billion. So not quite as strategic as you give me credit for, but that's the story. And of course now, with the passage of almost 20 years, it's pretty clear that e-commerce is growing rapidly. And by the way, I don't think retail is going away. And by the way, I don't think e-commerce killed retail. I think retail hurt retail. I mean, we ended up building 26 different formats of retail on top of each other. This country per capita has almost 5 times as much retail space per square foot as Western Europe with the same income level. But anyway, we're fortunate to have the wind of e-commerce on our back. But speaking, I just want to ask you something because it's related to that. I mean, one of the things that I've really admired about you over the years on the business side is that you've had an uncanny ability to call market cycles. And I mean, I remember the sale of your portfolio to Florida East Coast Industries, the sale of that company, and then during the global financial crisis, investing in bonds, basically on properties, and now very active in the residential and mixed use, really, development business. I mean, you couldn't have timed any one of those better, not even by a week or a month. So what is it about that? Is it the sixth sense? Is it analytics? What's the secret sauce? Because I want to know what you're thinking about next, because I want to get in front of it.
So certainly not analytics, but so I would say a combination. I'd say a combination in this sense. So I love the premise of your question because the premise of your question is wrong because I too have made some. So I tell you, when the Resolution Trust, remember Resolution Trust? I was the largest single exposure to Barnett Bank in South Florida. So when everything happened, I was on the siege, dealing with the banks, particularly with Barnett. And I went up to Jacksonville, I sat with Charlie Rice, who loved the University of Miami. And I said, Charlie, and his credit guys were, they were treating everybody like the plague, particularly if they were in Miami. So I said, Charlie, so he brought the credit guy in. I said, if I thought you could do better managing these assets than I could, I would let you have him. But you won't. And so particularly my land holdings. So I remember we had a very large piece that we were putting infrastructure down in Kendall and 157th, where Walmart went on the corner. And so I went to this home builder by the name of Herb Heffler, who I had never met, and I said, I'm here to sell you, I want to sell you some land. And the guy said, I don't want to buy land in Miami. I live in Miami, but I don't want to deal with entitlements. And I said, I will do everything for you. I'll deliver lots. And he said, why would you do that? I said, because the banks are pressuring me and I want to do the right thing. And the guy took a liking to me. And so we disposed of all of the assets, performed well I've never defaulted on a loan and I've never given a property to a bank. So we developed in fact, later I went on the board of Barnett. But I destroyed a lot of equity and a lot of value that I thought I had on those properties. So I promised myself that that would never happen to me, because I saw people making fortunes buying from the RTC. I mean, it was like so I told myself it's never going to happen to me again. So run the clock forward. I don't think it takes a rocket scientist if you pay attention to what was happening here. So when you see who the banks were giving money to for the type of projects they were giving money to, and it doesn't take that many loans given the, the capitalization of a bank to. So it wasn't that I was smart enough to. What did happen was I said to myself, I don't understand what's happening. I don't understand the valuation. I don't understand. So I'm going on the sideline. I'm going to sell everything I got. And so the first step that we did was merge with FECI. I always lost it after their assets. The very best industrial piece in Florida is that yard by, I hate to tell you how much that JP Morgan paid for that, particularly since I sold to you so cheap at IMB.
I knew that was going to come.
Yeah. No, but so I decided I don't want this to happen, so I was paying attention. So I think it's a combination of instincts and getting to know and knowing the market, not believing your own press clippings, not be so full of yourself that you think you're bulletproof. So, and I got lucky, I guess, right? So that's.
So you mentioned that you went, actually this is remarkable, you were very close to default with the banks,
Yeah.
Yet you went on the board of the bank afterwards.
Yeah.
You must have really impressed them. But one of the great things about you is that you served on the boards of some of the largest companies in America. I mean, the ones I can think of are General Motors, now Home Depot, and the list is really long. I mean, literally, I can think of 10 companies in the S&P 500. Did any of those exposure that you had to sort of the economy through those through that board service give you a better picture on what's going on in the world? Was that an important factor?
Undoubtedly, particularly long before that, I sat on the board of FPL, now Nextera, and I was on the board of Southern Bell, later Bell South. I chair the board of Bell South. And when you sat there early on and you saw where the growth was on telephone lines, and so you do get a wealth of information. So serving on a board, you get psychic income, right? Because it's not worth the fees but you get psychic income and you get a lot of knowledge. So undoubtedly, you see the world a lot different, particularly since, unlike you, who travel all over the world on business, I stay very, very concentrated here. So an opportunity to get out of my market and look at the world a little bit different, certainly it helps. It helps gives you a better picture of the world.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting and maybe interesting to some of the younger people in the audience. But I mean, we're both supposedly in the real estate business, but Armando's business is very concentrated in South Florida. But you're in every property type. I mean, is there a property type that you haven't done before that I can't think of one? Maybe, have you done a hotel?
No.
Yeah, that's probably the only one that you haven't done.
I'm getting ready to.
Okay, there we go. Check that one off the box. But so you know this market amazingly well, and you know every product type. Our business is very different. It's all over the place, but it's in one product type. Yet both models have been pretty successful. And obviously there was an intersection of those two because we ended up doing quite a few deals together here. But what's your view of that? How has the industry changed during your career, and what would you advise some of the kids graduating from this place to think about?
So my business was not, you have a business model. Mine was how I evolved to. So when my mother was alive, I used to have lunch with her Monday through Friday. And I would tell my guys when I started out, if I can go, touch it, look at it, touch it, get back on time to have lunch for my mama, it's too far away. So Boca was the kind of, so And later with FECI, then it was Florida, but still concentrated. So I find that I'm much less likely to make a mistake staying in my market that I know it very well. And then, but you can't know everything. So when I ended up with a lot of land when I bought those senior bonds too, and we ended up with a lot of land, I said to myself, I need somebody who's a home builder, and I found the very best, a friend, Jim Carr, who's a partner, and he's a home builder, he knows that. When we decided on the cycle that multifamily looked like it was going to be, we guessed right early on. So I went and got Andy Burnham, who's a guy that, so I try to find really, and that's advice to students, there are no good deal with bad guys. And having the right, I've been lucky to have had great part, by the way, when I bought a lot of mortgages, I was going to buy a mortgage in Naples, and had a conversation with the Collier family. Katie Sproul is here someplace, and they said, would you mind if we buy, it was a failed home builder inside of there, and they said, no, we would like to, we were looking at it, said, you want to buy it together, so we bought it together. So, I've had, I concentrate, I look to surround myself with really good people and great partners. I'd rather do the kind of industrial project that you and I did together. If it had not worked out, I couldn't have written a check at the time for it. So, I've done deals, I know Alfonso Monk is here with Prudential, USAA. We've been lucky to have an array of really good partners. So if I had advice for a young real estate student today, so I would tell you the advice that I gave my daughter, which is not the advice that I would give you, because I knew my daughter well, and I knew when she was between graduate school and before she got her MBA at MIT, I said, go out and become a research analyst. You want to be involved in real estate? Go and become a research analyst. And she got a job with Stoback, later JLL. So that was specific to my daughter. Generally, I would say go work in a shop like Manny de Sarragas that sees a lot of deals. And pick some good people. I hitch my wagon. How many people from Codina group that worked for us at one time in real estate and our projects and Prologis? Can you stand up for a second? I'll see how many of you they're there. So
It's pretty amazing.
yeah. So we had, we had at one time a concentration of talent that I don't think you could put together again. So.
That's interesting. When I got out of business school, there were no really large national, much less global real estate companies. I mean, every market had a number of partnerships, developers that were very successful, and they really had to go to ULI almost to figure out what was going on in another market. And now, basically, the business has sort of become a barbell, it seems like, with some real great local sharpshooters doing a variety of products like you, and then some larger companies that focus on the product type. And the middle has kind of over time hollowed out. Way fewer companies in the middle, it seems to me.
Hamid, of the global economy, what percentage of the global economy run through a Prologis facility at one time or another?
So 2% of everything in the global economy goes through our buildings.
Wow.
And that's about $1.6 trillion, if you want the numbers. So a lot of it. I mean, probably everything in this room has at some point either gone through one of our buildings or one of our competitors' buildings. I mean, industrial, most people don't know logistics and industrial because they don't hang around in industrial parks unless they're weird like me. But all of us have experience with retail and office and apartments and all that kind of stuff. But it is really an important sort of basic part of the infrastructure.
You are the largest landlord, is that, to Amazon, is that right?
Yeah.
Tell us about how that, the logistics, how has that changed?
Yeah. So, you know, notwithstanding all this recent talk about trade and all that kind of stuff, the global economy has really, supply chains have gotten longer and longer, more extended, and everything's happening faster. So I think most people thought of industrial as buildings next to plants that stored final goods and all that. We're not in that business, and you're not in that business, because the production end of the supply chain is really not important from a real estate point of view. The part that's really important is the consumption end of the supply chain, because if you lock up great land in good markets close into population centers, then particularly with the growth of e-commerce, you have amazing opportunities over time to grow rents and increase rents, and certainly that's something that we've done a lot of with Amazon, but a lot of other people. And I think the business is getting even more and more interesting with the emergence of the last touch. We call it last touch. Some people call it last mile business, where things are getting really infill in urban cores and actually going vertical in terms of densifying buildings.
I'm interested in hearing about that. So from the time that you and I did Beacon Lakes together, you are practically out of land. Some of the frontage turned out to be very valuable, Telemundo, Top Golf, lots of barriers to entry in Miami. So if I could only be in one asset class, so I love downtown Doral, that's where I spend a lot of time, and that's where we made a big bet. But if I could only buy one asset class, own one asset class for my grandchildren, it would be industrial in Miami.
Yeah, Miami's been a great market for us. I would put Miami, if you look at the best markets over the years in the U.S., for us, probably Miami, L.A., the San Francisco Bay Area, Seattle, have been the most profitable markets over time. And New York, New Jersey have been the best markets for us over time. I mean, there are other markets that are really important, like Atlanta and Dallas, Chicago, that have huge base. But those cities with big concentric freeways around them, they just keep expanding. So it's really hard to get growth pressures. You have good demand, but you don't have great supply. Here you have the natural barriers of obviously the water and the Everglades and all that. So we like markets like this where, you know, it's kind of like a big tube of toothpaste. You squeeze it and it comes in a narrow area.
You said infill and going vertical. So tell me about the markets that demand it or that you can afford to go vertical. Where are some of those markets that you've gone vertical with?
Well, you know, we built 50 buildings of, call it 6 to 8 stories in Japan. So Japan is the size of California with 3 times the population. And a big part of it is mountains and open land. So, you know, Tokyo is 45 million people in one region. So when you get that kind of pressure on land values, for example, our buildings in Tokyo are about $300 a foot, industrial buildings. And the land portion is probably 60% of that. So that's where it started. But I think Seattle, San Francisco, probably the west side of LA, and Miami for sure, and New York. Those are the 5 that I would say are the right markets for that kind of thing now. And the numbers are close to working in some other markets, but those are the main. There may be other markets that we're not in that are very infill markets, but are not big logistic markets, but they have customers. So Boston, for example. Boston is not an important logistics market. It's sort of the cul-de-sac of logistics because everything's done out of New York and New Jersey. But it could have a really good multi-story infill business in it. So those are the places we're looking.
You think Miami would get there on industrial, to multi?
Yeah, you need the rents to get to $20+ a foot, and it will get there. It might be a little while, but But remember, these guys are not leasing hundreds of thousands of square feet. Even the e-commerce companies are leasing 20, 30,000 square feet for this last touch business. So even though the rent per square foot sounds really big, it's a very small part of their costs. I mean, logistics rent is about 2 to 3% of supply chain costs. Transportation is about 50%. Labor is about 25%, and then you got a bunch of other things. So, you know, if you pay double for the logistics, and it's at the end of the day, it doesn't really change your cost structure.
So talk to me about labor a little bit. You and I have been chatting, and you know I've been chatting to your general counsel about training people out of high school and to go into these jobs. So what are you finding in terms of the labor market?
Well, let's start with our customers. It's their number one pain point is that they cannot find people to work in their warehouses. And sadly, there are a couple of factors that go into that. I mean, obviously, it's a tight market, 3.7% unemployment, but also a big chunk of the population is off the grid because they're on opioids or other kinds of substances and all that, and they're just simply not in the workforce. And there's a lack of opportunities. The on-ramps to a career are not that plentiful for high school graduates. So in a couple cities, starting in LA and then Chicago and Miami now, third market, we've started a number of community workforce initiatives where we co-invest with local NGOs in developing those programs, education programs for, and some of our customers are also involved with that because, you know, that it's not only doing a good thing, but it's also helping our customers in a major way. And we've had a really good reception as a result of that. A lot of people talk about automation as a solution to this, and certainly warehouses are getting more and more automated and the like, but full automation is quite a few decades away. So I think until then, we're going to need a lot of labor. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a career job. It just needs to get people to get on the first job and then from there go elsewhere. But it could be basic work skills, but it could be really basic things that a lot of people in this room take for granted, like showing up on time and knowing how to behave in an interview and how to get back to people and things like that.
So we're going to be implementing it. So in downtown Doral, we did a K through 5 elementary. Now we're building a 6 through 12. And in that high school, we're going to have not part of the curriculum, but in the evening for the returning vets. And then we're picking one school in a needy area where we would go in and say, if you come into, the school system has not been successful in doing this vocational in the past. So when I sat down with them and said, so what is your rate of success placing people? We don't know. We don't keep track of it. So I've been talking to Ed about a program we want to do. So with Home Depot, so we will tell the junior, if you want a way out of here, if you want to help yourself, here's a program that we would give you. During your junior year, we will teach you work ethic, how to fill resume, why you have to have all of those things. That summer, we would give you an internship in a store. And when your senior year, we're going to teach you a trade that is needed at Home Depot. And if you succeed, we have a guaranteed job for you.
Yeah.
So, and same thing with the home building. It could be the same thing with logistics.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think there are plenty of jobs like that actually are now approaching $20 an hour. I mean, again, it's a great first job, and for some it becomes a career, and for some just...
I got a question for you that I hope this is the right forum, but so what was the size of A and B when you did the deal with Prologis?
We were 160-ish million square feet. And Prologis was 430, I think. So 160 and 430. But in terms of values, it was closer because we were much more infill. At the end, the deal was 45% A and B value and 55% Prologis.
So there was a time when you and I started doing business together. Prologis was like, and you were not, and you kept growing. But having served on a lot of boards, when I read that merger, I thought, how much of this is it because they want Hamid to run the joint company? That's a question maybe I shouldn't have asked you, right? But from my perspective, I thought, so you were like, you know, you swallow the big guy.
Well, you know, there's a backstory to that. So actually, we ended up doing the merger in 2011, and the combined companies were about $43 billion in assets, which I think is still today the largest M&A deal done in real estate. But we almost did this deal back in 2001. You know, the original CEO of Prologis and the vice chairman came to see me in San Francisco in the summer of 2001, and they talked about putting the companies together. And at that time, it was explicitly for the reason that you just mentioned, because they didn't really have a clear succession plan at that time. And we came very close to actually making a deal. And this is what's interesting. At that time, it was 1.14, I remember this number like it's yesterday, 1.14 Prologis shares for each A and B share. And then 9/11 happened, and the world became a mess, and that deal went sideways, and they ultimately selected another internal candidate as a CEO, and ultimately at the global financial crisis, they got really levered, and they really blew up. I mean, that company, the share price went from 75 to $1.80, which is tough to do in real estate. I mean, by the way, all the other REITs got killed. We went from 60-something to about 10, 12 bucks a share. So, but they really, really got whacked because of this leverage. So ultimately, when we did the deal in 2011, it was actually initiated by me working with Walt Rakowicz, who was the CEO of Prologis, but he was a reluctant CEO. He had come in to rescue Prologis after it hit the wall and clean it up, and he really had given his retirement notice and came back in to help solve the company. So he did an amazing job for that company rescuing it. But we were able to put the two companies together, and interestingly, at that time, the ratio was 2.28 Prologis shares for each A and B share. So literally over the course of 10 years, there was a 2x difference in the relative values. That's why our 160 versus Prologis is 430 ended up being more like 45, 55 on the value. But so, you know, some people think real estate, it's pretty hard to destroy value in real estate, but boy, with enough time and money and leverage, you can prove that you can do that.
Hamid, do you remember at the height of the global crisis when you and I got on the phone? And you remember at that time, I told you I was buying these bonds and senior. So I'm not a big stock purchaser, but the only stock that I bought at that time was yours.
We appreciate it. I've always
it was
worked
like
for, it's always
11,
been clear
12.
for
That's
me.
the only thing I bought.
Yeah.
Because I understood. I understood the underlying assets and the management. So when you talk a little bit about, since you had a global footprint, so tell us a little bit and leave some time so you can give the students your advice. But tell me what you went through during the global crisis.
Well, you know, it was amazing. I mean, you know, real estate, all of you are in real estate more or less, but, you know, the capital markets completely froze up, and real estate is capital-intensive business, so it was pretty clear that people thought that nobody would ever raise another dollar of capital, and you know, obviously, even if you had low leverage, I mean, our company at the time was like 40% levered, which by real estate standards is very low. But, you know, just like everybody else, you know, there's maturity structure to your bond and your loans and all that. And if there's no money to replace that, I mean, it's a real problem. The good news is that the banks were in worse shape than the real estate companies, so they had their own problems to deal with. But some of the companies that were, you know, 50, 60% levered, all of a sudden with those drop values, got to be 70, 80% levered. But only one company, one big company really went broke. It was General Growth. That's remarkable. I mean, in prior cycles, like the S&L crisis and all that, all kinds of big real estate companies would go would go broke. But this time around, I think the larger real estate companies, the REITs and all that, are much better capitalized than before. Today, around the world, notwithstanding all the crazy stuff with trade and tariffs and geopolitical stuff, I would say, with the exception of China that slowed a little bit, and Brazil that's been sort of soft but sort of coming off the bottom, and maybe the UK, more London, but not the logistics business, I would say the rest of the world is in pretty good shape. I mean, there are better spots and worse spots, but the economy is very healthy. I mean, in the US, the logistics business, the vacancy rate is under 5%. I mean, it's just, and can you imagine, you probably don't track these national numbers, but today we're in the 9th year of an expansion, and still we're building less industrial than we're absorbing. How many times has that happened in the past where developers underbuild the market and all that? So I think buildings are getting bigger, communities are getting tougher, these projects are getting more expensive, regulatory environment is really tough. So it's getting more complicated to put this product on the market.
So I want the real estate audience to know that I was crazy enough at the height of the madness to think about could A&B possibly be taken private? If there was no money around and it was lots of difficulties, had we been able to take it public, you and I would be worth almost as much money as Bezos after his divorce. After his divorce.
I think
after you get through with the divorce and we'll slice it up.
I think it would take a couple
together.
more divorces, but
So tell us. So what advice do you have for
the students here?
Yeah.
I don't know. My advice is think of your career as a funnel, and early on try to get as much exposure to as many things as you can, because A, you'll develop perspective, and 2, you can figure out what you like best, and over time sort of get more and more focused on one thing that you can do really well. And like I said before, I mean, either you need to really understand the market and everything about it and only work in that market and have that competitive advantage, or you have to have the scale and the capital structure to be able to invest in technology and all that to run your business. Our business today is almost more about customers and customer service than it is about real estate. On the margin, 800 million square feet, you buy another million square feet, it's not gonna move the needle. But if you can do 2% more share of business with the customer and serve their needs around the world, it can really make a big difference. And the advantages that come with that kind of scale are tremendous. I mean, for example, our cost of capital is about 100 basis points lower than even the other big public companies, just because of the scale. Now, 100 basis points may not sound a lot, but if you're in a 6% return business or 5% return business, 100 basis points is a big number. And obviously, the G&A becomes really efficient too. So I think tomorrow's big companies are going to be driven by scale, cost of capital, ability to deploy technology, but most importantly, customer service. And that's, if you really want to know where I'm spending my time, it's on that customer service. So getting to know the customer at the beginning of your career and their needs and translating that into space, I think is really, really important.
So, Hamid, we're getting this back on. They were running over time. We're going to get them back on time, but this is being taped, you know? You signed a release. So if you and I have to negotiate another deal, when we talk about the promote, I'm going to send you a video of all the nice things you said about me.
Yeah.
So
the good news is that I'll have the same video.
I'm going to send you that and say, Hamid, view this and let's sit down and talk about how our next deal is going to work out.
Great.
Well, how about a hand for Hamid coming here from... Good.
Please.
After you.
Thank you.
Thank you and welcome back. We have something of a birth to celebrate with you. Last fall, we launched the inaugural real estate research initiative involving all 3 real estate programs at UM, and engaging our advisory board members from all 3 schools, architecture, business, and law, as well as past attendees of this annual Impact Conference. We knew we wanted to create something unique to the U and unique to South Florida, so we set out to tap the collective knowledge of this audience and to bring some qualitative insights and perspectives to bear on current real estate trends and topics. We engaged the board and faculty in discussing potential topics, and we selected trends in foreign capital flows for our first theme. And then as we developed the project, we quickly branched out from there to include perspectives on trends in a variety of sectors, the drivers of commercial market strength, and the factors seen as attractors and deterrents to investment in South Florida real estate. We were joined by an intrepid group of 3 graduate students from the MRED program, Francisco Masso, Aaron Sutherland, and Eli Stefan, who played a central role working with faculty and professional advisors to develop themes, hammer these into survey questions, design and deploy an online survey, and collect and analyze the results. The students collaborated with 3 very special and experienced advisors who drove the project forward. Anthony Williams of Ben Dixon and Amandi International, Mark Trone of Brookwood Associates, and a lecturer with the MRED program, and Anthony Graziano, Senior Managing Director with Integra Realty Resources, an MRED Advisory Board member, a Kane alumni, and really I'd say the linchpin for bringing the project home. I'd like to invite Tony and Mark to provide a quick teaser of the results.
Thank you, Dr. Bohl. So the focus of our research obviously was we started to look at what contributes to the health of the real estate market. And obviously we've been in a very active period in the real estate market, and one of the questions we asked is how much does transaction activity reflect the health of the market? And as transaction activity increases or decreases, what does that say about the direction of the market? Mr. Codina talked earlier about not using analytics or using a blend of analytics and gut feeling, looking at when pricing is starting to get crazy. And one of the things we were trying to tease out of this initiative is how much does foreign capital influence everybody's perceptions of whether the money is getting too crazy, and is there too much money in the real estate market? And when there is too much money in the real estate market, what happens to the market? So we're not going to present all of the findings. We are leaving it to you to download the entire report. I think it's about a 25-page report. But the overview is, does transaction volume matter? And the answer is, according to our advisory board members and many of you in the room, about 67% of you believe that transaction volume matters. Interestingly, when we asked, is transaction volume up or down, it was 50-50. Some people thought it was going up. Some people thought it was going down. What are the forms and sources of foreign investment? What are the drivers of commercial market strength? And ultimately, the report concludes as to what's hot, what's not. What was hot in 2018, and where do we expect 2019 to go? As to the sources of foreign investment, what was very interesting in our findings was that Canada, Brazil, Venezuela, and Argentina topped the top 5 in 2018. We left a category for other. In other words, if we gave you a country, or if you had a country that wasn't on the list, you chose other. And so what's interesting is the projection for 2019 is that other foreign sources actually will become take a more dominant role in Miami or South Florida in the coming year. Also interesting, drivers of commercial market strength. We thought capital availability, particularly equity and debt availability, was going to play very heavily, but ultimately the respondents really got back to the basics, fundamental basics, supply and demand, the economic activity, population, employment, GDP, and really what the fundamentals were with respect to vacancy. Where are the commercial markets headed? Also very interesting, our respondents, many respondents said, we're in good shape in 2018. The question is, where are we going to be in 2019? And you'll see a noticeable bias that people think as we head into next year, we probably are going to be less in expansion and possibly more in hyper supply, indicating that the market may be coming to an end. So also interesting really is, if you look at the graph, how Broward and Palm Beach County fared next to Miami-Dade. People are still pretty bullish on Palm Beach and Broward going into next year, which was an interesting finding. And then last, we asked what the key drivers were to attract investors. As many of you know, there's been quite a bit of talk about environmental concerns, sea level rise, climate change, et cetera, et cetera. When asked to rate what the drivers were on real estate in South Florida, the access to major trade hubs, our geographic location, and the investment profile of the investment ranked as the top 3. On factors that deter investors, sea level rise and natural hazards came in last amongst more prominent issues of expensive land prices, scarcity of land, and traffic and mobility concerns. And so we're going to be tracking this year over year. We want to look at this and see how investor perceptions may change. But those are the preliminary findings, and I would really encourage you to download the report. I hope many of you will participate in the survey next year, as this is not only a UM branded product, but a University of Miami owned product, and we hope to continue the research next year. So thank you all for your participation. I'd like to introduce Mark Trone from Brookwood Group.
Thank you, Tony. So what's hot and what's not? And so we have a teaser here, in effect, with a few slides. And of course, we have the full survey up on the website for all of you to look at. But in effect, what we're really looking at and what you can learn about is what the direction of and what the movement is of values here in South Florida for the different 3 markets. So that's the first thing. Secondly, of course, we go into detail about the environmental impacts or not, if you will, and how that is important to the rest of us. And then finally, what are the indicators that we think are going to take place and help move our markets in the next year? So to get all of those details, we're asking you to actually go onto our website at themiami.edu/REimpact. And by doing that, you can click on the research tab and download the full report. Also, if you're interested, we'd love to have you participate in our report for next year too as well. So I want to thank not only Tony and his incredible team at IRR, but certainly Anthony Williams at Ben Dixon and Amandi. They really were very helpful in structuring our survey. And then, of course, our 3 student members, Francisco Masso, Aaron Sutherland, and Eli Seffen, who were essential to this effort. So thank you again. Go onto the website, participate in next year's survey, and we appreciate your interest. Dean, I'd like to turn it over to Dean of the Architecture School, Rudy Alcurry. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you all for joining us today. A special welcome to our Masters in Real Estate Development Advisory Board members. There are 50 of you, 50 members here with us today. That's incredible, and thank you for everything you do to our students and alumni. So the MRED program also is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. Has become really the path-breaking program for our school, establishing partnerships and interdisciplinary bonds with the Miami Business School, the Law School, and the College of Engineering. Within the school, we now blend graduate programs in architecture, urban design, real estate development, and construction management, as well as our foundational 5-year undergraduate program in architecture. We collaborate with our colleagues in business and law on curriculum, competitions, case studies, and programs such as the Impact Conference. The academic caliber of our applicants has soared, and students are attracted to the dual degrees and certificates where they can actually combine fields such as real estate development and construction management, for instance. This semester, we saw a record number of 7 teams competing in the annual ULI Hines competition, which requires 3 different disciplines to be represented on each of the 5-member teams. We are hoping that their experience of working together for the first time in our new Thomas P. Murphy Design Studio building will produce a winning entry, just as the Murphy building itself, I'm delighted to report, has won the 2018 Building of the Year Award from World Architects, which was just announced a few days ago. Yes. Thanks again to the Murphy family for generously funding this building, to Architectonica for designing it, and to coastal construction, well represented here today for a magnificent job building our new, very heavily used and appreciated new structure. Now, for the session following, titled Curating Places and Creating Values. It features its own interdisciplinary mix of speakers who are at the forefront of creating the modern urban workplace and marketplace for the creative class. Developer Michael Phillips has been the driving force and creative mind behind some of the best known and highly regarded adaptive reuse projects in the US, including Chelsea Market in New York, Industry City in Brooklyn, Ponce City Market in Atlanta. Mr. Phillips is the vice chairman for the James Beard Foundation and sits on the boards of Friends of the High Line and the Real Estate Board of New York. Michael will be joined by Paul Dara, the Director of Real Estate for Google, where he is responsible for overseeing all aspects of real estate strategy, design, and development in New York. This includes delivering innovative workplace solutions and amenities that enable Google to thrive while accommodating Google's continued growth in New York City. Michael and Paul will be joined by our own Avra Jain, a creative developer extraordinaire who was lured away from Wall Street by Miami's charm, much to our delight. Avra is a force of nature with a passion for blending art and architecture in her outstanding urban development work, which has rescued and breathed a vibrant new life into historic Miami properties, including the Miami River Inn and the Vagabond Hotel. Please join me in welcoming Michael, Paul, and Avra to the Impact Conference. Please.
Oh, that's a good one. Where are you sitting?
Good afternoon, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. I'm really pleased to be sitting in this company, two very busy people. And so on behalf of the professionals here, and mostly the students, we really appreciate you guys taking your time. Today we'll be talking about process, placemaking, and innovation. And I think to start, I think we have a slide of some of Michael's work. I wanted to share this. We've all taken a lot of inspiration from these images. These are part of his adaptive reuse projects, everywhere from Boston, Ponce, Industry City, and then, of course, the Chelsea Market. I think that's a good place to start. I know everybody here read the headlines last year, the Google Jamestown transaction, $2.4 billion. I do have a slide that will share the numbers so that everybody can see the history of the transaction. But I'd like to start with you, Michael, and share sort of the origin of the relationship with Google, and Paul, where that stands now.
Sure. So we were in the investment group with Taconic at 111 8th in 2004 when Google first came with 30 people from San Francisco. And at the time, people said, what is this Google? We don't know if it's a real company. We don't know if they're credit worthy. And
we are.
So we sold them 111 8th in at the end of 2010. And they, over the last sort of 17 years, they've grown into both Chelsea Market and 111 8th and other places. And then in April of last year, we sold them Chelsea Market, much to my chagrin. So.
You seemed pretty happy at the time.
And the relationship now? I mean, I know it's kind of, so you guys now seem to follow each other a little bit, or is that just, We're going to talk about that?
So we work for Google and Paul.
Right.
He's our boss, basically. And
But I think what Michael's really great at, and you can see by Pond City and Chelsea Market, Industry City in New York, is placemaking. And so we aren't great retailers yet. But we brought on board Jamestown to actually continue to curate the market, because that is what is making what is the now center of our campus in New York a vibrant place and a key part of the community. So for us, having Michael's vision and as this ultimate curator of this amazing retail experience has been really powerful for us to continue to have this asset be such an important component of Chelsea, but also a draw for people well outside of New York and tourists globally. So excited to have him working for me, just saying.
So process, Michael, how do you find these places? You know, I ask you sometimes, do you find the buildings? Do the buildings find you? How, you know, is it demand driven and then you go shopping, or how does that work?
so, I think in our company's history, which is now 37 years of real estate investing, some of it's about true macro and micro dynamics in each market, and some of it's just about instinct. And I would say that when we bought 111 8th in Chelsea in 2003 and 2004, we weren't the first, we were the last, but we certainly weren't the first real estate firm that looked at 111 8th, and lots of people looked at it in past. There was an idea that maybe Penn South and those areas would become dynamic, but that was, as we know, a time when the meatpacking district was not the meatpacking district we know today. So I'd like to say that we had some vision, but I also think that there was, on a per pound basis, you were just having a completely different discussion about the real estate. And so some of the other things like Industry City or IDB in Boston or Ponce were not dissimilar. They're big white elephants that people couldn't quite get their hands around, and we focus less on what we're going to do in a business plan, which is probably not what students want to hear when they go to school, but more on what the real estate feels like and what we think the consumer or the person who's going to inhabit it will feel when they're in the building. And I know that's a little odd, but that's, I think, how we approach everything. And so the buildings, people bring us buildings, but mostly we stumble across buildings. My partner is a runner, and he goes and runs in the morning in cities and comes back and says, hey, I saw this, let's check this out. And so that's how a lot of stuff happens.
Yeah, I mean, I've had the privilege of meeting your board, and so how do you get a German pension, $10 billion pension fund to get on board? I mean, they were pretty institutional. How do you get them? How do you underwrite it? Or is it just your track record? Is that enough?
Well, I mean, I think, we have several sources of capital. So we have a German closed-end fund business, which is about $4 billion in assets under management. We have an institutional domestic private REIT fund, which is about $4 billion, and then we have about $2 billion, maybe $3 billion on balance sheet now. So it depends on what pocket it fits in. A lot of these things don't fit easily in a pocket, and we buy them ourselves. But if they fit in the parameters of the fund, then we have a fairly clear mandate to invest. I would also say something about being a company that is just three partners without a lot of institutional kind of noise in the system makes identifying, running a due diligence process and acting a much more efficient process than maybe some other people go through. So, but I think it's definitely a track record issue, and also, we love real estate, and we all, and so seeing it and being in it, the most interesting thing is a big abandoned building somewhere,
Yeah, bricks and mortar, pretty sexy, right? So Paul, I really enjoyed talking with you this afternoon. You have an architecture background. I thought that's good. So all the architecture students, I think this is a big shout out to that. And you built this business. what I found interesting was how much you focus on community and the real estate, you know, that thought that you went from, say, tenancy to ownership. What does that mean? Is it cultural? Is it about having a home? And how do you make, how you are growing that side of the business?
Sure. So as Michael said, when we started in New York, we were 20,000 square feet. And as we grew in New York, and even to this day, of the 2.5 million square feet that is 111 8th, we're in about 60% of it. So we're still cobbling together the building, and we're in a somewhat disparate occupancy. And the same is true for Chelsea Market. We're in about half of that. But for us, New York is a key hub. And so when we started to hit a critical mass and recognized that we had a big presence in New York and we were going to stay in New York, the goal was to begin to be an owner, to begin to participate in the community in a very different way than just being a tenant in a building. And that's when we elected to purchase 111 8th. I came on board 2 years ago, and when we triggered the conversation about the purchase of Chelsea Market. And it was a little bit of, we are 7,000 people in New York right now. We're growing, we're planning to double in the next 5 to 7 years. And some of that is because we think New York is such an important market for us. Different than Mountain View in the Bay Area, it represents diversity. It has, the tech industry is growing in New York. And so to have a big foothold, it's currently the second largest campus in our portfolio, but that's second to Mountain View that is 45,000 people. And so what's unique about New York is it has the infrastructure that can get people to commute to work in a reasonable way, and that there's residential and the diversity of economy. So owning and being a part of the neighborhood and investing in the community is a big part of our ethos, which is part of why we elected to purchase Chelsea Market as well.
Can you talk about Pier 57, or can we talk about it?
So we have 4 properties currently in New York, and they all just start at 8th Avenue and they move westward, as I say, towards Mecca. But the last piece of real estate is that we're now in the middle of construction on is Pier 57, which is part of Hudson River Park Trust. There's a park on the roof, a public park on the roof. There's a marketplace that will be the ground floor, and then we're taking the balance of the building. And it is, for us, it's where 111 8th is a little bit of a fortress. If you saw the pictures, it's somewhat of a full city block building that's got this massive presence. What the Pier represents is a chance for us to have more porosity with the community. We're helping to develop the market. We are creating 24,000 square feet of community engagement space, which is around education and entertainment for the community. And then we're opening the door so that the public actually has more visibility into Google and gets a sense of what we're up to and what we're doing. And it has a chance, and then we're also using it, it's about 80,000 square feet of event space for our clients. So for us, we've shifted from much more of we kind of take care of Google to bringing our clients in and really looking at how we take care of the community. So that's been kind of version 3 of our real estate venture.
Michael, you curate these fabulous mixed-use projects. How do you go about finding the content? Are these restaurants, startups finding you finding them, and then your commitment to incubating them is important?
We have a core sort of team inside Jamestown. So we have architects, we have food and beverage specialists, we have project managers, we have creative and marketing people, and we really have a very active dialogue. It was fascinating to watch the 2 gentlemen in the first panel talk about getting out of your market and paying attention to what's happening in the world. And we do that as a group pretty regularly. And obviously, I love to eat. You can tell by the way I look. And so we go to a lot of restaurants, and we talk to a lot of companies, and we're very engaged with that space. And I think both from an office standpoint, a residential standpoint, and also a retail standpoint, we think our job is to be the best partner to our tenants. And so if that's helping a small restaurateur get into business by providing them business advice or connecting them with the right architects, or it's providing an amenity base for an office tenant that they don't have to have it domestically as a cost center, but it's additive to their plan, it's a little like we heard earlier, our business is customer service. And so being knowledgeable about that and paying attention, I'm not a vegan, but I eat at a lot of vegan restaurants so that I can understand that trend. And I think that's what makes the difference for us.
And when you buy something that's like 2 million square feet, like how do you possibly imagine that, plan that out? I mean, is it sort of organic or is it really programmatic from the beginning?
Yeah, so in the case of Ponce City Market, it's 2 million square feet. It's the largest brick building in the southern United States. It was like Sears catalog fulfillment center. And it had been, it was built in 3 phases. It belonged to the city of Atlanta for 28 years, and they only ever occupied 20% of it. And so when we bought it, it was absolutely the proverbial white elephant. We came in after another developer had stepped away in 2008. And so I would say that we had a plan. Our plan was not the plan that we ended up with, but we had a plan to do retail, residential, and office. We didn't think the office would be immediately successful. We planned about 400,000 feet of office, and we planned about 350,000 feet of retail. And amazingly, the office took off right away. And so some of it was reactive, and some of it was really well planned. But part of our real estate strategy around design is to keep it a little messy, whereas others are sort of really rigorous about the best design in the real estate. For us, it's about having unexpected experiences. And so it was okay to figure some of that out as we went. It was a single phase, $380 million project, and we completed it in about 28 months. And so the process was really a lot of sleepless nights and a lot of kind of figuring things out on a sketch pad. But so we're, knock on wood, it's still got its doors open.
So Paul, he talks about curating space and public space for the benefit of tenants. I mean, you guys have a pretty good cafeteria, so I understand. So I'm not sure how much you guys are going to Chelsea Market. How about the workforce stickiness? Like, how do you keep your Google employees happy, and how do you attribute the success? How much do you attribute that to the success of your business? So
I think when Larry and Sergey first started in the garage and the food was delivered to keep everyone working, and it was initially about productivity, right? So we have a pretty amazing program amenity component, which is everything from the food service and massages and the bus, right? But it's all about really making our workforce productive and giving them what they need to actually be able to be at work and be present at work. And so we're now looking at what's the next phase of that amenity, and how do we take and have an ecosystem that starts to be part of the community. So childcare shouldn't just be a Google childcare component, but it's how do we have childcare that's in the community that also Googlers can activate, that then links us even in a more unique way with the community that we're occupying. But again, a lot of it is about really enabling our employees to thrive and be productive. And so what are those things that are unique to Google? A lot of people are kind of creating their own Googleplex. And so it's an exciting workplace conversation, productivity conversation, and then it's part of our culture. It's really about bringing people together to have the conversations that in the moment of brilliance, it may not be at your desk. It may be when you run into each other at the cafe or the barista. So that's the goal, or that's kind of what we're driving towards. Which gives us a lot of latitude to really kind of be creative about space and placemaking, but also the third place that's not your desk that you work at, which again happens in a lot of different places within our footprint. So,
and increasingly it's happening intercompany, not just, the old way was sort of campus fortress. The new way is integrated ecosystem where the parts of your IP that are protected are in protected zones, but the part that aren't, to encourage stickiness of your tenants, to have them integrate more with other tenants of other employees, So.
Well, you guys are both placemakers, and we talked earlier, wherever you guys are, people come and they follow. How does that, so teamed up together, I mean, as a real estate person, everybody would like to know, well, where are you guys going next, right? So, so how do you guys plan for the future? Like, what are you looking for? What's next? Let me see, I think I got an idea for you.
I'd like to take a page from the first panel and the fact that how far the drive was from his mother for
I've got
lunch
your building
every day.
right
I see
there.
it.
That, right? Yeah. See, nice.
Look at that, right
Yeah,
there.
right there.
Right, just
Right in
making
Miami.
sure.
Right in Midtown, right where at the center of everything.
Yeah, I got it.
But I think the idea that you have lunch with your mother every day and that informs your limitations on where you're going to invest by how long it takes to get there is not so different about the way the founders of Google or other people have figured out where they want to be and where they want to build their workforce. And so it sounds a little bit, out of left field, but I do think that people go where they want to spend time and people make plans. And I think that speaks a lot for Miami because it's such a nice culture and climate. But I think that gives a little bit of context for all of us to think about.
Yeah, and I know, Paul, a lot of people ask you questions at lunch, how do we get tech here? We did talk about how UM is going to have Dr. Frost's $100 million contribution, how much that helps. So when you guys are looking at expanding within cities that you're in or other cities, what are you looking for? What advice do you give to growing cities?
Yeah, and just for perspective so in the Bay Area, 50% of the people we hire are relocates to the Bay Area, which is ultimately not sustainable. And so part of what we're looking at, what are the other hubs? And New York, as I said before, is a big one. Austin, given their tech talent. Detroit, Chapel Hill, Atlanta, those cities where there's an opportunity to take and build a basis of technology talent. And I think, Mike Bloomberg, as mayor, created Cornell Tech Center to create a feeder of tech talent that didn't exist in New York. The fact that Amazon's coming to New York, maybe, is a great win for us because it just continues to diversify New York City as a tech hub. One of the things we're looking at is we're developing about 8.5 million square feet in San Jose, which is a transit-oriented destination. And part of that is because we recognize we have to pull people out of the Bay Area. Our employees can't afford to live there. And they need to be in a way that they can get to work efficiently. And so mass transit is a huge enabler. And we can help to redevelop San Jose, which is the second largest city in the United States. I mean, it's an interesting phenomenon. But it's a bedroom community. So it's a huge city, but there's no industry there. So we made a big bet to actually help develop San Jose. And as Michael said, half of that is not actually for us. We want to bring other diverse businesses to be part of our ecosystem. So it's not just the corporate campus off in the middle of nowhere, but that we have the ability to create place. And so we're going to be partnering a lot more retail. Again, we don't do retail. So how do we take and create retail that makes the community active? So San Jose will be a great, for us, a great incubator of placemaking at a scale that is, if you think about it, 1 million square feet a year, which totals to 8.5 million square feet, is pretty spectacular. And we plan to, it's a big investment. And we think that that's the right approach to shift to kind of shift the paradigm of the corporate office park.
And all these innovative ideas now, like let's say the digital nomads and so forth, is there a time where Google lets the employees are traveling around the world and working from their iPad, or how important is it for them to be at their desk within the space?
That's a great question. So we value people being at work because that's where collaboration happens, that's where innovation happens. And so we're full on in everyone has their desk, everyone comes in, And we have a flexible work policy, but we do not have a work from home policy. And it's because of what, kind of what the collective whole delivers versus the individual who could work anywhere. We have technology, we could work anywhere, but that's not the model.
Interesting. And Michael, everybody would like to know your thoughts also on innovation, let's say on the retail side, the bricks and mortar,
Sure.
how that all plays in.
Yeah, I would also just say, just in the technology space, both in the residential and the office space, we have a venture piece of our business and have been really focused on developing app technology or investing in app technology to help enable the community at a broader level for both domestically inside the buildings, but cross buildings and cross disciplines. So from a retail standpoint, connecting the consumers in the building to the retail on the ground or in the neighborhood. From a retail perspective, I mean, look, I think everybody here is paying attention to the evolution of retail. I think there's a lot of very interesting digitally native retailers that are coming out now with big store mandates because they have to, one cannot exist without the other. So you're starting to see that growth. I think the winners and the losers will make themselves clear. The companies that can migrate to an omni-channel way of doing business will succeed and thrive, and the ones who won't. And so I think from my standpoint, I really like retail as part of something much, much more dimensional, so a true mixed-use environment. And I think from our perspective about leasing, there's a company called Value Retail in England. If you guys don't know it, you should pay attention to it. They do all 2-year leases, and I think that's really fascinating. And so the idea that you can finance residential on 1-year leases, but you can't finance office or retail that way has got to change, and I think it is. We built Ponce City Market on a model of all percentage rent leases so that we could be dynamic about that, and it really paid off for us. And I think that that is a key kind of belief for us going forward, that we want the flexibility and dynamism, and we want to curate, and we say no as much more or as much as we say yes to people, because the collection of people and the dynamism, whether it's office or retail, is important. We have a building in Boston called the IDB building. We said no to banking. We said no to healthcare. We went right for true innovation companies, and we caught every major tenant that came to the market in 18 months because we decided that was what the mandate of the real estate was. So I think from a retail standpoint, more retail landlords need to do that. That would be.
Yeah, I know, but it's very hard to get the lenders there, I think. Everybody's always asking credit, and even with banks, always, they want you to even have 10-year leases, which is actually really a free give for them, really.
Just leverage less.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we all, looking at where we are in the cycle, we need to leverage less anyway. So if you decide that piece of your business is going to be leveraged in a different way, or you're going to use your equity in that piece of the business, I think you can achieve it. It's much harder on a single retail asset, but in a mixed-use environment, it's easier.
And for you guys, Google, you have a lot of cash flow, so you don't leverage, I assume. What you do? Or what's your model on real estate? Is it? Do you look at the numbers, or is it more just still about creating home?
So
yes, they look at the numbers.
We look at the numbers, right? But there's a theory. If we're in a hub where we have committed, then we'd like to be at 75% owned and maybe 25% leased, so we have some flexibility, right? I think and I think this is true for a lot of commercial office tenants, right? They really don't know where their business is growing. So the ability to have flex space to swing up or down has got to be a dimension of a portfolio. But we're going to steer towards ownership because we are putting a significant amount of money into the asset, improving it, and we want to hold it for the long term. So that for us, we're very fortunate. We have some money in the bank, and we can deploy it appropriately for where we view the real estate as accretive to the business goals. I think the one thing which I think this room should think about, which is that real estate as a sector is so under leveraging technology. And that's a big conversation, right? And so we're spending a lot of time looking at that. And you can't replace what is the experience of an asset with technology, but you can certainly leverage and have and it's not just about smart buildings, but about placemaking with technology and really connecting the tenancies. What is that technology can deliver? Because right now I'd say as a sector, as real estate as a sector, is we're really behind in that, in kind of what is the opportunity. And obviously Sidewalk Labs and Google are investing in kind of making that connection of technology platforms within what would be appropriate applications in real estate. So.
And grow with Google. I mean, you ask about retail. Grow with Google program is an amazing outreach program for small business, and I would encourage all the landlords here to communicate with your tenants about it and connect with them, because it helps you penetrate in your marketing or engage services that you wouldn't otherwise think about and aren't really available to small business. And so I think that's a great,
that's right.
Yeah.
So architect background, so how much of that skill set are you using in your job? Are you actually in there designing? Are you project managing? How does that tie into what you're doing?
So I personally think architecture is like one of the great foundation educations, because it is not about a single discipline, and it's about this understanding of things. And so what is, I would say 80% of my day-to-day is about architecture around either understanding the asset, understanding what it could deliver in terms of space for our employees, really understanding the value of place in the way Michael described it. And then there's the financial component of it, which is clearly important. But I think if you generate value, the financial comes. So while we look at it as a cost-benefit analysis, we're erring on the opportunity creation, right? Which is where we're spending a lot of our time.
We were, this morning when we picked up Michael, he was getting ready to look at some plans. I don't know if they finally came through, Michael on PDF. So how involved are you in creatively on it, not just vision, but all the way through the process?
So I think as a company, everything we do starts with design. Whether it's, we talk about financial modeling, which is essential, but you can't really, you can't model something if you don't know what the product is, right? If you don't know who the customer is, if you don't know what the absorption rate is, and all that comes out of desire and demand, right? And so from our standpoint, for my job, I spend a lot of time working with designers and
well, you are the final approval.
Right.
Of
Everything
the
at
brand.
Jamestown rolls up.
If you really answered the question directly, it would be.
Okay, yes.
Yes.
So even in the car when Avra picked me up this morning, I was looking at building designs on my phone in between looking at real estate with Avra. And so I would think that this idea of this dual degree of business and architecture is just genius. And I think that being able to develop both sides of that is essential. And being able to connect the design with constructability is what our business is all about, because that all comes down to cost and return.
And I think to add in, there's something in between the architect and the developer, which is the corporate real estate executive, right? So that's who happens, right? Google happens to be one of the largest developers in the world.
Right.
So to the extent that so I was an architect by training, I had my own practice. This guy named Mike Bloomberg called me up to say, hey, I want you to head up real estate for me globally. I spent 14 years doing that, building offices all around the world, building a portfolio for Bloomberg. So that's how I got my education in the development side of it. Right. But it was with a fairly unlimited and a fairly dynamic growing company of, kind of a company growing 30% a year over year.
You seem to like those.
Yeah, I like those. Yeah. But that's where there's huge opportunity. So there is a niche called corporate real estate executive, which there isn't a program for yet, so we should talk about that.
The dean's listening, I think. The architecture students, a lot of them, they want to know, how do they get to there? How do they get here? How do they get here? And by the way, as you know, I have 4 architects that work for me, so I value their skill set. So how do they get there? They're coming out of school and they're saying, hey, I don't want to be a CAD monkey. I don't want to be, so how did you get to where you were? What was critical? What chances did you take in order to get to where you are, Paul?
So I think it was understanding the client, right? And being able to bridge the gap and understand the business component of it at the same time as understanding the design, and then kind of marrying the two together, right? And then being creative about coming up with the idea, right? So putting ideas in front that then address the business solution. But I think one of the gentlemen earlier said it. It's like this notion of be broad when you come out of school, right? Understand all of the components that make up this amazing kind of real estate industry, and then figure out where is it that it best aligns with your passion. Because if you're not passionate about what you're doing, you're probably not having a great day. And I am pretty passionate and have a great day every day I go to work. So I think, but I think it's understanding where is it that you fit in that amazing kind of life cycle of real estate.
Well said.
Yeah. And Michael, you get a little glimpse into your past?
I have to acknowledge Jonathan Rice, who's sitting in the front row over here. He financed my first project I ever did when I was 22 years old. And I didn't know what capital markets was. I was literally I had a retail company, and I needed warehouse space, and I had a manufacturing business, and I learned that through following what I was passionate about and asking a lot of questions and really taking calculated risk. I think it's important for kids to form a point of view. We talk about being politically correct about everything and about liking everything, but it's important to know what you don't like and know what you don't want to do and know how you don't want to spend your time and know what you don't want to eat or what you don't want to wear so that you can know what you do. And once you figure out what you do, test it. And I think there's lots of ways to do that. And I've been fortunate to have had a lot of mentors in my career and a lot of really smart people who said, you sound crazy, but that's an interesting idea. Let's do something with it. And I will tell you that our industry, the real estate industry, is 100% based on that, right? I mean, the things that people do every day, Witkoff and his buildings in Times Square. I mean, you're rewarded for that. So I would say to young people, figure out what you're passionate about specifically in terms of product. Because I came to this as a product guy, not as a real estate guy. And that has served me well every day.
Paul, any mistakes or anything you think about sometimes that you could share that might be like, what might have done differently or anything, or a little bit of vintage advice, as we would say?
No, I think we're at risk right now of, we have so much data, right? And there's just so much information. And if you aren't able to take the information and make it relevant and synthesize it, that then actually gets you to a recommendation or solution on whatever it is, I think that's the biggest risk we have. And I work with a lot of engineers every day, as you can imagine, and they're really great at telling me about all the data that they have collected, but they can't speak to the so what of it. So that, I think, is probably, and if I look back on my career, where I haven't been successful is when I haven't been able to actually take and bridge it to synthesize to actually be compelling about a solution or a product. So I would say that's the place where, if you're coming out of school, make sure you're able to make that bridge and speak in a way that that's going to resonate with people and be compelling.
So I wanted to leave, I know there's going to be a lot of questions here, so I'm going to leave some time for that. I'm going to do something though really quick. So Michael has a love for historic preservation, and in fact knows a lot about Miami. So I got you a then and now.
Nice.
Thank you.
And then I'm going to put him on the spot, and I'm going to have him sign a Chelsea Market cookbook. So if you weren't already impressed with Michael, he's actually an author of 3 cookbooks, and he does sit on the J's word to word. So by the way, it's out of print, Michael.
It'll be in reprint soon.
So I'm going to make sure you saw it. He's going to be reprint soon. So he's authored 3 cookbooks and his love for cooking. So before we go, I would like to give everybody a chance to ask some questions, and if not, I can continue to ask them, but I know there were several people that wanted to have a few minutes. So anybody for questions?
Well, I mean, I think a big obvious one is Warby Parker, right? We know they have less than 1% of the eyeglass market, but their stores are productive at, you know, $1,400 a square foot. I think they're somebody who came into the space, and there's others in that space that look like the new dynamism. It used to be cosmetics and jewelry were the things that filled your inline stores. Those sales are flagging, and so it's going to be head shops and eyeglasses, I guess, right? I mean,
He's not kidding about the head shop.
Right, we did our first head shop concept at Chelsea Market right before we sold it to Google.
Right before the purchase, yes.
The price went up?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I'm curious what y'all think opportunity zones, what the impact is going to be on development.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting concept. You know, we talk a lot, Avra and I talk a lot about opportunity zones, and we look at a lot of opportunity zones. Our basic fundamental premise is it's great if there's a tax benefit, terrific. It will make, you know, to me, I think lending in an opportunity zone is really compelling because you know it's the last thing somebody's going to give up if the going gets tough because they have so much of a recapture issue. But for me, I think I only know how to invest in things I'm passionate about, so I don't want to buy things that just because they have some tax efficiency tied to them. I think we heard earlier that there's no good deal with bad partners. There's also, there's no good deal out of bad real estate. But I think there's certainly in opportunity zones great opportunities, and we are, we're as interested in them as anyone.
Paul, are you guys looking at opportunities in Paul? Because I know Amazon sort of made a big deal of it. Is that anything you guys are focused on?
So we have a slightly different approach than I think Amazon took in their most recent effort. I think we are growing organically, right? I think for us, it's a little bit about how do we give back. So as an example, in San Jose, we're committing to doing affordable housing for the community. That will be some residential components for Google, but also for the community. So I think we take a very different approach than some of our competitors. And we've grown organically in the cities we've grown in, and we've contributed to the community differently. So it's a little bit different conversation.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting too. You actually even invest in some of the partnerships you have, the small businesses. I think that's, I didn't know that it's not really part of your platform, it's part of your community growth. You know, what bucket is that in?
So we have we have some money that we are out in looking at what are companies, what are industries where we can continue to, so if Google's mission statement is to make information globally accessible, right, which is really at the root of it, we're out looking at what companies, what industries can we take and enable advancement through leveraging machine-based learning, artificial intelligence, and really and become innovators around different technologies than our core business. And so there's a whole subset of teams that are actually out investing, and I think there's a couple people in the room who probably have been partners to Google with unique opportunities, apps, et cetera. So we continue to do that, and we're in biopharmaceuticals, we have Verily, so we're expanding the reach in that way.
How are you dealing with the housing for your employees in New York City?
So New York's a little bit of a unique market, right? Like New York has a great breadth of housing, and so it's very different in terms of how we think about New York than how we're looking at Mountain View and the Bay Area. So it's not really a component of what we're up to in New York.
And your employees, how do you guys offer services? Do you help them find housing, or is there any obligation on your part to help them with that in any of your locations?
We have relocation services, but yeah.
Michael, how did you feel about getting into a behemoth like Ponce City Market, historic rehab, trying to make that work and not knowing what the cost of rehabbing something like that would really be in the end?
Yeah, good question. So we went 100 million over budget, and but we also, our scope grew quite a lot, and we leased a lot of office. Our office leasing, when we started the market, we were at a 15 triple net. When we ended, we were at 48 triple net. We were the highest market rents in Atlanta. And so there, you know, the good thing about our company is that we have a very strong balance sheet. The Ponce project was very much, you know, it's not for the faint of heart. And my partners, we all sort of, I was the one who actually went into it, you know, sort of with my heels in the ground. And they said, no, you can do this, let's figure this out. And so, it was hard. It was probably the hardest thing we ever did in our company's history, but it's been immensely successful. And it's important for context to know that we did it while doing 12 million square feet around the country at the same time of the same product. So it wasn't, we weren't just, you know, it was the proverbial, you know, kid whose eyes are bigger than their stomach. We all sort of, we did this 1.3 million thing in Boston. We did 6 million feet in Brooklyn. We did 600,000 feet in Long Island City. I mean, it just, the whole thing stretched our organization to its limits. But it was, in the end, probably one of the things that we'll be most proud of as a legacy. So, but it was not, it was definitely a noisy process.
It's a crown jewel.
Thank you.
And in Industry City, if anybody hasn't had a chance to go out there, that now, if you thought Ponce was big,
Yeah.
Industry City is 3 times as big, 6 million square feet. What's the strategy there?
And the difference between Ponce is Sears had maintained Ponce for 80 years in perfect shape. There was 1,300,000 feet of maple hardwood floors floating on sand in all the, you know, in all the floors. I mean, it was in pristine shape. And we got, you know, LEED certification and $40 million of tax credits. It was an incredible project. Industry City was just a forlorn, 150 elevators, 6 million square feet. We owned the streets, like everything, like literally. And we partnered with Angela Gordon again and Belvedere, and it's been, we have 160 employees on that project. And in fact, our head of marketing is here today. And we have 37 people in the development office there. And so it's literally like, you know, developing a city by itself. But it's definitely, it's been fun.
Yeah, and you guys do a lot of programming there. Like you had the art installations, so you're doing a lot, you know, outside, inside.
Yeah, so we're big believers. Like Google, I mean, Google has a whole head of experience or employee experience team that's health and wellness, it's food, it's engagement, and we do the same thing as a company. We have a team internally that does everything from social to events, graphic designers on staff, architects, music booking agents. We have a whole, and for a real estate company, you'd think that's an odd thing to do, but when I was growing up, the Rouse Company was something that I thought was the coolest thing going, right? I mean, you guys have Bayside here in Miami. So I'm 49, turning 50 in a month. I grew up partially in Miami, and so to me, that was what I wanted. I wanted to be the Rouse of this generation. So we do all that. And, you know, as Lauren would tell you, we have more art exhibits, more, you know, lunch and learns, and, you know, social media optimization classes. You know, it's in our DNA.
We'll spend a minute on Sunday supper.
Sure. So We do, we partner with the community and run, I'm the vice chairman of the James Beard Foundation, which is like America's Michelin system, if you haven't heard of it. And we do, around the country, a series of sort of long tables, but we started at a Chelsea Market 12 years ago and bring in chefs from all over the country to raise money for our neighbors in our community to give them either their food insecure households or scholarship programs or impact. We have an impact program with Babson College for Women in Leadership. And so this dinner is this economic engine to raise money for food programs in the West Chelsea neighborhood. And so Google has been a great partner with us on this. And what we found is that that throwing a party is great for everyone. It's great for the tenants, it's great for the community, and we do things like a Halloween costume contest where Google's employees are part of some of the judges, you know. And in Ponce, we have the nursery school at Suzuki comes through with kids doing a parade at Halloween in their costumes. It's just simple things that you would see on the main street in your community that we take into our DNA as an operator.
Anybody else? So I would like to, I think just as we close, maybe one final thought that you might want to share with the students, or one wish.
So I think be bold. Right?
Yeah.
Obviously, there's some boldness there.
Yeah, just a little.
I think that's really the opportunity, right? There's a lot of change to still happen in the real estate world, and it's about be bold, make a unique place, and it will thrive.
I would also say talk to people on airplanes. It's the thing that everybody hates, right? You don't want to do it. But you talked about a data-rich environment. I always make it my business to learn about people around me. It's how I form a customer profile. And, I was sitting next to a guy today who's coming to this conference, and I asked him what kind of cars he drives, where does he shop, what does he eat, where's he going on vacation? And that is all stuff that you should file away, because, it's great if you can push a button analytically, but we've been able to ascertain who our customer is for hundreds of years. And so I would just say, in that, be inquisitive, would be...
When I'm looking at new neighbors, one of the things I do is I always go to the local bar and I hang out at the coffee shop, see who's coming in, coming out with them. And I would just add that, for the students, be thoughtful. If intentions are good, good things happen. So thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Nice book.
Yeah.
Now I have the privilege of introducing the best boss that anybody could ever have, appearing at his second real estate conference, the Dean of the Miami Business School, John Quelch.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. It's been a wonderful day so far, thanks to Professor Hughes and the many others who've made this program possible. It's a remarkable occasion every year on our calendar, the Real Estate Impact Conference. I really appreciate everybody in the room attending, coming from near and far for this very important event. Thanks to all of the sponsors and indeed to all of the faculty members at the 3 schools who combine to make this wonderful occasion a reality each year. It's my honor and privilege to introduce, on behalf of my colleagues from the Schools of Architecture and Law, the president of the University of Miami, Dr. Julio Frank. Many of you know Julio by now. He is first and foremost a physician. And a physician who chose to make society his patient as a practitioner of public health. If you think about it for a moment, the strides that have been made in global public health over the last century have brought life and comfort to more billions of people than perhaps any other field of human endeavor. And so we're especially proud to have him, a public health leader, as our president. As you may know, he was formerly the Minister of Health in Mexico, then became the Dean of the T.H. Chan School of Public Health at Harvard University, and is now our president. Just one last word of introduction, if I may, because the bio is brilliant, but it's also a little bit tedious. When I talk to parents of our students at the University of Miami, I ask them, well, why did your son, why did your daughter come here? And of course, they have some occasional comments regarding the quality of the curriculum, or they've heard of a particular department and so on. But the most frequent comment that I hear is, well, we learned a little bit about the president of the University of Miami, and we want to feel comfortable, and we do feel comfortable, trusting our sons and daughters to someone with that level of humanity, with those values. And that is, I think, what sets our president apart. We can go through the motions of curriculum design, we can go through the motions of administrative improvement, but in the final analysis, we all want to be led by someone who has values that we believe in. And our parents and our students are truly blessed, along with the faculty and staff, to have Julio Frank as our leader. Please welcome Julio Frank.
Thank you, John. That's the nicest introduction I have ever gotten. Wow. The truth of the matter is that it is an incredible privilege to be president of a university with such amazing critical mass of talent among our brilliant students, our incredibly outstanding faculty, and our devoted staff. And it's a job where you get to interact with smart, devoted people every single day. And part of that is reflected in this great conference. I do believe that one of the functions of universities is to act as conveners, institutions that actually help to bring people from very different paths, from academia, but also from industry, and from government, and from civil society, and members of the community at large, and bring them together to analyze and discuss and reflect on critical issues of our times affecting our societies. And conferences like this allow us to do exactly that. The other value we are emphasizing at the University of Miami is the value of interdisciplinary collaboration, because problems do not organize themselves in the same silos in which we organize our schools and our departments. And this conference is, again, a great example of that. It brings our students and faculty together with professionals, with recent alumni, with leaders in the different areas of real estate. And it creates that space for convening and dialogue among people with different pathways, but focused on a common theme. And it does that with an interdisciplinary focus. Because as you just heard, this conference is co-hosted by the Miami Business School, the School of Architecture, and our law school. So it brings thought leaders from very different fields to share best practices. Today, I have the enormous pleasure and privilege of introducing an amazing thought leader, New York Times best-selling author and journalist, Malcolm Gladwell. We're really, really very grateful to Malcolm Gladwell for his willingness to share his insights with our students, who I'm sure will be greatly inspired, and everyone who's attending this conference. Malcolm Gladwell has been a staff writer for The New Yorker since 1996. He is also the host of the podcast Revisionist History, and co-founder of the podcast company Pushkin Industries. Now, as I know everyone in this room knows, he has written a number of books, 5 books over the past 20 years, to truly international acclaim. And I was telling him that, the thing I love are, first of all, the titles. You read the title of the book and you say, this has got to be a super interesting book. And then the subtitles. The subtitles make it even more enticing. And then, of course, you're drawn into the book by the title and the subtitle, and then you find that it is indeed a brilliant piece of insightful analysis. You know most of these names or titles of books. The Tipping Point, subtitle, How Little Things Can Make a Big Difference. Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking. Outliers, The Story of Success. And then this one, What the Dog Saw and Other Adventures, which is a collection of his journalism. And then in 2013, David and Goliath, Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants. I mean, the titles themselves are a literary masterpiece. He tells us that he's writing now or finishing a new book, so I can't wait to read that one as well. All of these 5 books were on the New York bestsellers list. He's been lauded by business leaders and criticals alike, and his books have been lauded by both business leaders and criticals alike. And both the books and the articles often deal with the unexpected implications of research in the social sciences, particularly in the areas of psychology, social psychology, and one of my own fields of study, which is sociology. And of course, in The Tipping Point, he also uses a lot of my other field, which is in public health, in epidemiology. It is very fitting that Mr. Gladwell would share his expertise with students, as I understand that his own curiosity and love of learning was encouraged when his father, a professor of mathematics and engineering, allowed a young Malcolm to wander around offices at a university, the University of Waterloo, as he was telling me, in Canada. So truly an outstanding, exceptional individual with a level of insight that I think has inspired many of us. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Malcolm Gladwell.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. It's a real pleasure to be asked to speak at this conference. I'd like to thank Vanessa Grout for inviting me and to come to Miami from New York in February. Not nearly as hard as it sounds. I apologize, I'm massively underdressed. I assumed with the kind of typical New Yorker snobbery that in Miami everyone would be in flip-flops and poolside, and I thought I would try and blend in by dressing as I did, but I appear to have made a terrible mistake. I'm also reminded whenever I come to Miami of, I once went to Dubai just before the financial crisis, when Dubai was at its kind of height of craziness, and the cab driver took me from the airport to my hotel, and he couldn't find the hotel, and we circled around and around and around and around. And we found it, and he turned to me very apologetically, and he said, I swear it wasn't there a month ago. That's what I think of whenever I come to Miami. You're very well done on your part. I'm not, I know that this is a conference sponsored by the business school and the architecture school, but I'm not going to talk directly about either business or architecture, because I have a rule that says that I never talk about something that my audience knows more about than I do. I actually learned this the hard way. I once gave there's a school, this is a digression, there'll be a number of these. There's a grad school in Manhattan called Rockefeller, which is probably one of the most elite science graduate schools in the world. There's just an unbelievable number of their faculty are Nobel Prize winners. And they started this speaking series where they would bring in people, outsiders, to come and address their faculty and students, basically lambs for the slaughter. And I was one of the lambs. And I gave this talk, and I foolishly, in the middle of the talk, started going on and on about some missile from the 60s. And at the end of the conference, some little guy raises his hand, and he still has the German accent, and he says, with respect to your mentioning of the missile something something from 1960s, you are 100% incorrect. How do I know this? Because I designed the missile. You never really recover from an experience like that. So I'm just not going to talk about architecture or real estate development at all. I'm going to go off on a little bit of a diagonal away from the nuts and bolts of this conference. But I do want to talk about something that is conceptually of interest, I think, to all of you. I want to talk about buildings and streets and neighborhoods, but I want to talk about their psychological and social implications. Now, that seems like a little bit of a strange topic, I know, because we don't think of buildings and neighborhoods and streets as having psychological implications. We think of people as having psychological implications. Buildings are inert, right? They are concrete and steel and wood. They don't possess characteristics and traits like people do. But I think that's actually a mistake, and that there is something to be said for thinking about the built environment in this way, looking through the lens of psychology. And I want to give you two examples of what I mean by this, or what it means to look at the built environment through this kinds of lens. And the first involves a man named David Weisberg. David Weisberg is a criminologist. He's probably one of the most important criminologists of the 20th century. He won, the criminologists have their own version of the Nobel Prize, which he won a couple years ago. And he, by the way, it's sort of lovely that they have their own version of the Nobel Prize. If you were smart and you were doing your own version of the Nobel Prize, you would also call it the Nobel Prize. I mean, why not? Like, why not just, anyway, side. They don't have a monopoly on the word Nobel, right? You can just call it the... Anyway, he's a criminologist, and he starts out, he graduates from Yale University with his PhD, and he gets a job working on a project in New York City. And it's a pilot project in the 72nd precinct in Brooklyn. Now, I don't know how many of you know your Brooklyn, but the 72nd precinct is south of Greenwood Cemetery, parts of Sunset Park, and east of the docks. So in the 1970s, when he was invited to do this pilot project there, that would have been one of the worst neighborhoods in New York. It's still not a great neighborhood, but it's been gentrifying pretty dramatically. But in the mid-1970s, it would be about as bad an urban neighborhood as existed in the United States. You know, in the backyards of apartment buildings, there would be 5 feet of trash. If you walk through a hallway of an apartment building, there would be, you know, Weisberg remembers refrigerators in the hallway and rats running free. I mean, just about as horrendous a place as you could possibly imagine. And what the NYPD was doing was they decided they wanted to see whether if they had street patrols of 2 officers, street patrols, that would change the level of crime in the neighborhood and also affect the attitude of the people in the neighborhood towards the police. And Weisberg's job was to accompany the beat officers as they walked around the 72nd and to make notes, to sort of observe whether these cops were making any kind of difference. So he does this 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, for an entire year with 9 separate beat officers in the 72nd. So he gets an exposure to this neighborhood of the sort that most of us never get to an urban neighborhood. And he's all dressed up in his suit and tie, and he's got his notepad, and everyone thinks he's a detective, and he has to always tell them, no, I'm actually a grad student. Big difference between those 2 states. And he, now what he had been taught in grad school about crime were 2 things, and they're the same things, the kind of conventional wisdom that all of us think most of us think when we think about crime. The first thing that he had been taught was that crime is linked to major social problems, right? It's a function of poverty, of drugs, of unemployment, of discrimination. And wherever you have those kinds of broad social problems, you would have crime. And every city in the world, major city in the world, had an area which they referred to as their high crime area, which was an area where those 5 social problems existed in some large degree, right? So New York had places like the 72nd Precinct in the South Bronx, Los Angeles had South Central, Miami had Overton, London had Brixton, Paris had the outer boroughs. I mean, I could go on, the outer suburbs, I could go on. Crime, the idea was linked to these troubled neighborhoods. And the second part of the orthodoxy was about criminals. Criminals were presumed to be, and this is Weisberg's phrase, he said he was taught that criminals were like Dracula. They were people who had a overwhelming, strong motivation to commit crimes. These were people who had powerful impulses. They were being driven by addiction, by mental illness, by greed, by despair, by anger, and that meant that they would go to extraordinary lengths to commit the crimes, to do the things that they desired to do. So if crime belongs to communities and criminals are like Dracula, driven by these powerful motivations of greed and despair and addiction and mental illness, then crime should be everywhere in the 72nd Precinct, right? The 72nd Precinct is about as bombed out an area of New York as you can imagine in the mid-70s. So you would expect that as Weisberg walked the streets of the 72nd day in, day out for that entire year, he and his patrol officer partner should be encountering crime everywhere, right? Wrong. They don't encounter crime everywhere. He's walking these streets every day for an entire year, and what he discovers is that the only places they see crime are a very, very small number of streets. They are spending all of their time reacting to problems, not throughout the neighborhood. In fact, they never go to 90% of the neighborhood. They're spending all of their time on just a few short street segments over and over and over again. And by the end of the year, he turns to his police officer partners and he says, why do we even bother worrying about the rest of the neighborhood? Forget it. This crime's all in this 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 spots over and over again. Now, it's important to understand what a weird notion this is, right? Criminals have legs, they have cars, they have bicycles, they have subway tokens, they have all, they're driven by strong impulses. Why on earth would they be confining their activities to just a few choice blocks over and over again, right? Why wouldn't they, if they were in search of a car to break into or a person to mug and they couldn't find a car or a person on one block, why wouldn't they just move 2 blocks over? What he was observing made absolutely no sense. But after an entire year of making these observations, Weisberg began to think that something about the orthodoxy that he had been taught about crime was wrong. So then he gets a job at Rutgers. And Rutgers in this period still does, had one of the most innovative criminology departments in the country. And he decides that what he wants to do is to test out this theory empirically. Is what he saw in the 72nd Precinct just a weird function of Brooklyn, or is it true everywhere? So he decides he wants to do an experiment, and it's sort of hard to do because if you think about it, back in those years, when crime was reported, it was recorded by precinct. You would say we had a murder in the 72nd Precinct or the 68th Precinct or a murder in this part of Miami or that part of Miami. It didn't come with a street address, right? It never occurred to us that that was a relevant fact. But he really wants to see how crime occurs on the highest level of specificity possible. He wants to know what block it occurred on. So he had to find a police department that would give him access to that kind of data. And finally, he finds a very forward-looking police chief in Minneapolis who agrees to let him see the street-coded crime data for Minneapolis. And what Weisberg does is, remember, this is the 80s, before we had computerized Google Maps. He puts on the wall of his office a giant map of Minneapolis, blown up about as much as you can blow up a street map of the city. And for 2 years, every time there is a crime of any significance in Minneapolis, he puts a pin in the map, right? And at the end of the 2-year period, he takes a step back and takes a look at the map. And what does he see? He sees that Minneapolis, which has all kinds of bad neighborhoods, that crime does not occur in the bad neighborhoods of Minneapolis. What crime? Crime occurs on a very small number of streets scattered throughout the entire city. In fact, by his calculations, 3.3% of the street segments, a street segment is not the whole block, just the half of a block, 3.3% of the street segments in Minneapolis account for 50% of the crime in the entire city, which is it's hard today to kind of conjure up the kind of awe and excitement and disbelief that that finding caused in the mid-1980s, but it blew people's minds. There wasn't a single person in the field of criminology who expected to find that result. It made no sense. Right? So Weisbrod said, all right, let's see, maybe this is something that is specific to the 72nd Precinct and Minneapolis. Maybe Minneapolis, maybe because they're all Scandinavian, it's weird over there, right? So they decided, let's try it other cities. So they did Boston. Boston, what did they find? 3.6% of the street segments in Boston account for 50% of the crime in Boston. They did Kansas City, same thing. They did Seattle, same thing. They did Dallas, same thing. Every single city they did this analysis for in the United States returned exactly the same result. That less than 5% of the street segments in the city are responsible for over 50% of the crime. So then he thinks, okay, maybe this is an American phenomenon. Let's go overseas. So he starts going overseas. He's Israeli, so he says, I'll do Tel Aviv. You can't imagine a place more different from Minneapolis than Tel Aviv, right? On the continuum, Tel Aviv is here, Minneapolis is over here. Scandinavians, Ashkenazi Jews, right? Big difference. So he goes to Tel Aviv. What does he discover? Exactly the same thing. 3.5% or 3.4% of city street segments are responsible for 50% of the crime. There has never been a major urban center that has been studied along these lines that has not returned the exact same result. And in fact, this phenomenon now has a name. It's called the law of criminal concentration. And it is a law. It is an absolute principle that in any urban area, a tiny fraction of the street segments account for the overwhelming majority of the crime. Now, what does this mean, the law of criminal concentration? Well, we know a couple of interesting things about it. The first is that the handful of streets that account for the overwhelming majority of crime are pretty stable. So it wouldn't be all that interesting if we said that 3% of the streets in Miami, of the blocks in Miami account for 50% of the crime in any given year, but those 3% change every year. They're constantly mutating. That's not an interesting finding. What we find is the opposite, that the same streets show up year after year after year. So I'm going to show you a map. Can we pull up the first slide? What I'm about to show you is, this is a map that Weisbrod made of Seattle. And what you see is just what he's talking about, which is that Seattle has, you see that each dot represents a street segment where there are what he calls a hotspot, which is one of those street segments that has an overwhelmingly greater amount of crime than the rest of the city. And what you see is in the downtown core, obviously where the population density is very high, you have a lot of hotspots. But throughout the rest of the city, there are no bad neighborhoods. There are only bad street segments scattered almost at random throughout the residential areas of Seattle. Now, that much would be expected under the law of criminal concentration. The really interesting thing is that that map is 10 years old. And if I showed you the map from 2018 for Seattle, it would look almost identical to that. These places don't move. Right? They are extraordinarily stable from year to year. Now, second thing, what happens if you crack down on a hotspot? What happens if you say, okay, well, if all of my crime is on 3% of my city streets, shouldn't I just deploy all my police resources to those 3%, right? So what happens when you do that? Now, the assumption of people in law enforcement is if you do that, then all you'll do is move the hotspot, right? You crack down on one block where you think there's a lot of crime, the criminals are just going to walk to the next block in response, right? So Weisberg says, is this true? Let's figure out whether this is true. That phenomenon is called displacement, by the way. So what he wants to do is to figure out, is there displacement? So he does an experiment, and if you could bring up the next slide. This is an experiment done in Jersey City, and the pink area in the middle, the triangular area in the middle, is an area of Jersey City where for many years there had been a prostitution hotspot. So basically most of the sex work in, open-air sex work in Jersey City occurred in that 6-block by 6-block triangle. So what Weisberg does is he convinces the Jersey City Police Department to put 10 officers on permanent patrol in that 6 by 6 block area. Now, if you know anything about, as I'm sure you do, about policing, you'll know that putting 10 extra officers in a 6-block by 6-block area is huge. That's like you can't walk down the street without seeing a police officer. That is an insane level of law enforcement presence. Basically, he says, flood that area with as many cops as you can find. And then he adds all kinds of other, he gives them extra resources, and he fast-tracks prosecution. Basically, he makes that the most heavily policed area of Jersey City in the history of Jersey City. Right? And he tells the cops, by the way, you cannot leave the 6-block by 6-block area. You can't leave the pink triangle. You stop at the border, right? And so he wants to see, well, what happens? Well, the first thing that happens is really logical, which is that prostitution falls by 2/3, right? He puts them all out of business. Right? Okay, so then his second question is, what happens to those prostitutes who are no longer working inside the pink triangle? Do they respond to this crackdown simply by moving into either the dark blue area or even the pale blue area right outside? I mean, all they have to do is walk 2 blocks and there's no more cops, right? It's normal Jersey City rules, which is anything goes. It takes them a couple weeks to understand the cops are like literally going to the edge of the border and stopping, right? So if they want to continue their work, they have to walk 2 blocks. And what he wants to know is, will they walk 2 blocks, right? Displacement theory would say, yeah, they'll walk 2 blocks. Of course they will. They're rational actors, right? They want to keep doing their business. What does he discover? They don't walk 2 blocks. There's no displacement. The prostitutes do not move outside of the pink triangle. And I'm going to read to you. So he sends all of these graduate students. By the way, I love how graduate students are always assigned the most glamorous tasks. In this case, to go to talk to prostitutes in Jersey City. And they has them interview them. And it's like, well, what are you doing? Why aren't you just moving 2 blocks? And they say, here's the kinds of things they would say. I'm in this area. I don't want to move because it'll make it hard on my customers. Or, no, I don't want to build up a business again. I've done it once. I don't want to do it again. Right? Now, our notion of what a sex worker is someone who has a powerful motivation to engage in that kind of work, whether it's they're in an abusive relationship with a pimp, they're driven by drug addiction or by poverty or something. We think of people who have a desire and a motivation to engage in this kind of trade, and so for whom moving 2 blocks would not be a big deal. But what he finds very quickly is that they're not somehow special in their motivation. In fact, they sound a lot like we do, right? They don't want to move. Why? Because moving's stressful, which is what everyone in this room would say if they were asked to move their business, right? I'm going to quote to you again. They talked about how hard it would be for business. They'd have to reestablish themselves. They talked about danger, people they don't know. What do they mean by people they don't know? Here I know who's going to call the police and who won't call the police. That's a big issue for them. When they're in the same place, they begin to have a high level of correct prediction about people. Going to a new place, you don't know who the people are. Right? No, again, they are talking just like businessmen, people with retail operations, people with the kind of businesses all of you people run. That's the way you talk, right? Well, why don't you just move to Dallas tomorrow and start trying to open a real estate firm? Well, because all my contacts are here, all of my knowledge is here, all of my local knowledge, my friends are here, my on and on, right? They're speaking the language of normal people, and they're saying, I have the same aversion to moving as anywhere else. All right. So if crime, we know point number one of the law of criminal concentration is that crime is located in a few specific areas, and that those areas are pretty stable. And point number two is that if you crack down on a hotspot, people you don't get displacement. People won't just pack up and move somewhere else. You'll actually curb the underlying activity you are trying to defeat. So, third thing, are hotspots obvious? In other words, if you drive around a city, can you see intuitively where all of the criminal activity is taking place? Well, I actually tried this. I went to one of Weisberg's co-workers is in Baltimore. Baltimore, as you know, is one of the most dangerous urban areas in the United States. And it has also been, analysis has been done of Baltimore, and it follows the same rules as everywhere else. 3 to 4% of the city's streets produce 50% or more of the crime. So I drove around Baltimore for a day with a criminologist, and she would drive me to a random block. She would stop the car, and she would say, is this a hotspot or not? Right? And we kept track of my guesses. How good was I at picking out the 4% of streets where all the crime is? And the answer is, I was terrible. Right? Now, some times, you go to occasionally when you drive around Baltimore, you'll see a pristine street where there are children playing, and the lawns are all mowed, and the houses are all freshly painted, and the old folks are in rocking chairs on their front porches, and you pretty much know, okay, that's not a crime hotspot, right? Those are the easy ones. But the rest is really, really difficult. You can see bombed out places, and you would swear that boarded up windows, and you would swear that this is a place where there's a terrible amount of crime, and there isn't. And at the same time, you will see neighborhoods that look totally normal, and then the criminologist would tell me, actually, there were 150 police calls on that block in the last 12 months. 150, right? That's insane. That's one police call every 3 days. There are individual blocks in Baltimore where there are 300 police calls in a given year. Right? But that fact does not advertise itself in the way the place looks. There's some kind of complex dynamic going on underneath the surface that is not immediately obvious, at least to the untrained eye. Right? So what do we make of this? Well, the word that criminologists like Weisberg use to describe this phenomenon is coupling. And what they mean by that is that individuals do not exhibit behaviors independently of the places in which they're operating. But in fact, behavior is coupled to place. That when you talk about a crime, in other words, you can't speak about that crime unless you tell me not just what the crime is, but where the crime occurred. Those are the two crucial facts in understanding the nature of that deviant act. Now, I think this is, not just me, people in the world of criminology think this is an extraordinary observation. In fact, I think they're correct. They think of this as one of the central insights in modern criminology. It turns almost everything we think about crime upside down. Right? It turns criminologists who had previously thought of themselves as purely psychologists, it turns them into geographers. It turns them into people who have to all of a sudden think about something they'd never thought about before, which is place, right? And the nature of place and the kind of behaviors that are created by place. Let me give you another example of coupling, because once you understand the principle of coupling, you see it everywhere. This one has to do with suicide and the Golden Gate Bridge. So as many of you know, the Golden Gate Bridge, the most famous bridge in America, was opened in 1937. And in the 80 years that it has been, in operation, 1,500 people have taken their lives by jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. There is no structure in the world that has been witness to more suicides over the last 80 years than the Golden Gate Bridge. It is so bad that I don't know if any of you ever saw a documentary called The Bridge, where a filmmaker just put a camera at one end of the bridge and just had it run continuously for, I think, 6 months. And in that time, he recorded 22 suicides. It's one of the most chilling documentaries you'll ever see. But the point is that suicides on the Golden Gate Bridge are routine. they're so routine that you can put a camera on one end and reasonably expect to capture images of not one or two, but dozens of people committing suicide over the course of a given year. Right? So let's ask the same question about the Golden Gate Bridge and suicide that Weisbert asked about the prostitutes of Jersey City. Is there displacement with suicide, or is it coupled? Now, in other words, if you were to block people from committing suicide on the Golden Gate Bridge, would you prevent the suicide, or would they simply move to another bridge and jump off that bridge, right? Which is it? Now, the assumption of the Golden Gate Bridge Authority, the government body that runs the Golden Gate Bridge, is that suicide in the bridge that is a relationship of displacement. Their assumption for years and years and years is that it would be pointless to spend millions of dollars putting up a suicide bridge, a suicide net on the Golden Gate Bridge, because you'd spend all that money and you would deface the bridge, and all you would do is move people to the Bay Bridge, right? Bay Bridge is a couple miles away. It's all they have to do if they want to jump off a bridge is just drive across town, right? So what's the point? Now, this is an authority, by the way, which is not opposed to spending money to alter the bridge. They spent millions of dollars putting up a median barrier for cyclists on the bridge, even though no cyclist has ever lost their life on the Golden Gate Bridge. But they felt that was a reasonably good use of public funds because it struck them that there was a strong possibility that someone might lose their life cycling on the Golden Gate Bridge. They spent millions of dollars putting a median barrier between the east and the westbound traffic on the bridge. Why? Because they felt there was a reasonable possibility that someone might get hurt in an accident, a car moving from one side to the next. They spent millions of dollars putting up an 8-foot fence at one end so to prevent people from throwing trash over the bridge onto Fort Baker, which is just below the bridge. Why? Because they wanted to prevent people from littering on the bridge, right? They're not opposed to spending money. But when it came to putting up any kind of suicide prevention measure, they said, you know what? It's pointless. And by the way, it's not just them who thought it was pointless. They would, like clockwork, every 10 years, have a public hearing where they would ask the question, well, we just had another 100 suicides this year. Should we, or 50? Should we put up suicide prevention measures? And the people who would come and testify would overwhelmingly say, no. What's the point, right? I'm going to read you. You can go to the archives of the Golden Gate Bridge Authority and read the public comments. I would say they run 9-to-1 against any kind of suicide prevention measure. Here's a sample. Here's what one person says. People bent on suicide will find many ways to do away with themselves. Pills, hanging, drowning, cutting arteries, jumping from any other bridge or building. Wouldn't it be much better to spend the money on mental health care for many people instead of worrying about the few that jump off bridges? Right? That's the position that most people take. By the way, not just San Franciscans. From time to time, there have been national public opinion polls where the question is asked, do you think it'd be a good idea if we put up a suicide prevention measure on the Golden Gate Bridge, given that more people have died than anywhere else? And what you find is the overwhelming majority of Americans say, no. What's the point? If you want to commit suicide, you're going to commit suicide, right? You'll just move somewhere else. There's not a shortage of tall places to jump off in a city of San Francisco. So, when it comes to suicide and the Golden Gate Bridge, we believe in displacement. We don't believe in coupling. So is that the correct position to take? Well, there was, a couple years ago, a psychiatrist named Richard Seiden realizes there was a very clever way to test this question, and that is that periodically people jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge get thwarted. Either they jump into the bay and they survive, or they're stopped, someone grabs them before they can jump. And it turns out that there have been, in the years that he was studying, there were 515 people who had been thwarted from jumping off the bridge. So he said, look, this is a perfect way to test this. If there is displacement, then those 515 should logically have gone on to commit suicide some other way, right? If there's coupling, if they really just wanted to commit suicide at that moment on the Golden Gate Bridge, then very few of them should have gone on to commit suicide some other way. So which is it? Well, the answer is that of those 515 who were thwarted from committing suicide on the Golden Gate Bridge, 25 went on to commit suicide some other way. The overwhelming majority of people, once they were prevented from committing suicide in that moment on that bridge, never tried to take their own life again. There is not displacement of suicide on the Golden Gate Bridge. There is coupling. Right? Now, that's a really hard thing for people to accept. I've just given you all of these examples of people, of how the public in America writ large, how local people in San Francisco, and how the Golden Gate Bridge Authority itself have fought for decades the idea that suicide might be coupled. It just didn't seem to make any sense, right? The intuitive position was that the place that you were trying to commit suicide was irrelevant. You were driven by an impulse, and all that really mattered was what was going on inside your own mind and heart. That idea was so hardwired into the way we thought about suicide that it is not until this year, more than 80 years after that bridge was opened, that a suicide prevention net has finally been built. And by the way, we're not just blind to this when it comes to suicide, we're also blind to this when it comes to crime. When you talk to police officers and police departments about the law of criminal concentration, most of them will deny it exists. When David Weisberg would come back from walking the 72nd precinct with his fellow officers, he would turn to them in the end and he would say, "Why are we walking through the whole precinct when the crime only occurs on the same 5 blocks over and over again?" And he says they would look at him like he was crazy. They didn't understand that that's what they were doing. Or think about the arguments we've been having in this country about aggressive policing and things like stop and frisk. Right? Why has that become such a controversial issue? It's not because there is something wrong with the idea of police using aggressive measures to get guns off the street. I think many of us would agree that's a good idea. The problem is that the police use those tactics everywhere, right? They use them throughout the bad neighborhoods, what they call the bad neighborhoods. But there are no bad neighborhoods. There are only bad blocks, right? And their failure to understand that this is a tactic that is appropriately only in those very, very small sections of an urban area where the overwhelming majority of crime exists. Their failure to understand that connection is what has created this issue, made this issue into something as controversial as it is. We have a very, very hard time wrapping our mind around the notion that crime is not everywhere. Crime is a function of very, very specific places and environments. Now, why have I been giving you a long lecture on criminology and public health? Because I think there is a really, really important lesson here for all of you. Why? Because you are custodians of the built environment, right? And when you sit down and you talk about what it means to create built environments for our society, I think you talk a lot about the practical implications of that. How are the buildings that we build going to be used? I think you talk a lot about the commercial implications of that, right? How can we make money off these kinds of buildings? I think you talk a lot about the aesthetic and the practical implications of it. How can we design these, how best to design these buildings and how best to build them? But I think that we very often gloss over the emotional and psychological implications of what you're doing, because the built environment matters, not just on some kind of practical or economic or aesthetic level, but it matters in the way, it matters intimately to the way people navigate their own lives, right? You can think about what the law of criminal concentration suggests. You could have 2 people who are equal in every way, but one person happens to live on one of those problematic blocks and as a result may well be disposed to crime. And that same identical person who lives in the 95% of the city, which is totally fine, that person may never commit a crime at all. Or think about what it means in terms of suicide. We're so accustomed to thinking of people who are suffering in that way in terms of what is going on inside themselves, right? Inside their hearts and minds. And to think that our only recourse, if we want to stop someone from taking their own life, is to minister to their own psychological and psychiatric difficulties. But what does the law of coupling tell us? it says we have another option. It says that that terrible act is coupled to a place, a specific place. And if we can think about how to make that specific place a safer environment for someone who carries with them all manner of travail and trouble, we can prevent that tragic act from taking place. Now, I've given you two very dark and depressing examples of the importance of the built environment, but you can flip it on its head, because we're not just saying that that problems and deviant behavior are linked to place. What this is telling us is that all manner of fundamental human psychological reactions are linked to the particulars of the places that we inhabit, right? This kind of thinking, I think, leads us to ask all kinds of really important questions. Is there a way to build a hospital such that the people in the hospital will get well faster? Once you've read through the literature on criminology and the literature on public health and suicides, that's not a crazy question anymore. Right? It makes sense that there would be an intimate connection between the place where you are when you are sick and your response to the medical treatment you receive. Or is there a way to build an apartment building that isn't just beautiful or affordable, but also brings joy to someone's life? Not a crazy question after you've gone through all that stuff about suicide and crime. We now know that people's well-being and choices and behavior is powerfully linked to the immediate particulars of their environment. That's an important question to ask. You know, it strikes me that we've been doing versions of this when we think about the work environment for people in recent years. We have been asking questions like, open space versus cubicles, or is there a way to structure people's work lives so they'll be happier and more productive? Is there a way to pay people so they'll be more connected to the enterprise? Is there a way to structure management so that employees will feel like playing a better role in the organization? But I think we can go further with that, and we can ask some really blue sky questions about the spaces we're building for people, right? Maybe when we're thinking about designing office spaces, the questions about light and air and well-being and the feelings that people have when they're in a space, maybe those ought to be the questions that we start with, not the questions that we address at the end of the process. Right? Now, I realize that this whole talk has ended on a very, very touchy-feely note, and you are not by nature, you do not by nature belong to touchy-feely professions. But I would urge you not to get lost in the nuts and bolts of your professional work, and not to lose sight of the fact that human beings don't float around. We're not rootless. We aren't people without ties to our immediate environment. We live in places, we respond to places, we're shaped by places, and the people who build places have a responsibility to think about those issues. Thank you. I think I have time for some questions if anyone is, I can't really, oh.
Thank you for the lovely speech. I once heard you say that today if you want to be a doctor, you have to be in the relationship business. My dad's an oncologist, and I could not agree more with that. How would you define the modern day developer?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So the question is, how would I define the modern day developer in terms of what a modern day developer needs to be in terms of what I've been talking about? And well, I think a lot of what I was saying was that people in your world ought to take their roles more seriously. I think what you do matters more even than you realize. That's really what this is about. That, I could have given you 10 examples of coupling between behavior and built environments. I only chose 2, but once you start going down that list, let's just start with the Golden Gate Bridge. that the engineer who designed that bridge and the people who approved those designs and allocated funds for the building of that bridge did not take full responsibility, did not understand the full implications of what they were doing. They didn't take their job seriously enough. They thought they were building a mechanism for getting from the Marin Highlands to the island of San Francisco, right? They didn't understand, no, they were doing much more than that. They were creating a permanent part of the landscape of the region that would have a powerful effect on the troubled in that area, right? So what I'm saying is they thought they were doing this little narrow thing, and they were in fact doing something that was much more crucial and important. And I don't think if that had been properly explained to them back in 1937, they would have been adverse to that understanding of what they were doing as really important. I think that they were just under a misapprehension that they were simply builders and designers and architects. And they didn't understand that there's no such thing as simply a builder or designer and an architect. You're contributing to the fabric of the society in which we live. So I would just say that the modern developer is someone who needs to think big about their role in the world.
Hello. Hi, sorry. You mentioned that when you went around with the criminologists in neighborhoods with high crime, you couldn't really identify where the crime was happening. So what was the cause for some blocks having more criminal concentration, and what can we learn from it, especially in doing the right developments in areas which are not wealthy, to make sure the standard of living is right?
Really interesting question. We have some of that work is going on now. Remember, all of these insights are in academic terms, very, very recent. It's only in the last, if you think about it, the Golden Gate Bridge is putting up their suicide prevention bridge, their suicide prevention net this year. The police departments are embracing the implications of the law of criminal concentration, have been doing that in the last 5 years. So this whole field is brand new. We have some ideas, some of them are obvious, like, that in, where there are not eyes on the street, where there is inadequate lighting, where there's a whole sub-literature on bus stops, on what happens at bus stops. Because at bus stops, there's all kinds of unusual commingling of people that creates criminal opportunities. But the really interesting stuff is stuff that I don't think we fully understand, which is, are there subtle features of design that have an influence on people's behavior and mood, among other things. And that's the stuff, that's the really exciting thing that I think people are only now trying to kind of identify and act on. So I think it's too early to give a definitive answer to that question, as important as it is.
I think, aren't you really suggesting that there are certain energy vortexes that are conducive to crime, suicide, and perhaps happiness and joy as well? And that buildings create those spaces.
Yeah. That's actually a lovely way of putting it. I was afraid of being too touchy-feely because I'm the non-businessman from, downtown New York. So I thought you would all think I was soft if I talked about energy vortexes, but I'm glad you have. Yeah, I do. I think that's what I mean. I think there is something, one really, really interesting question is, how much does it matter if a building and the space it's in is beautiful and is visually arresting, we know it matters on a aesthetic level, but But how much does it matter in terms of the behavior of those who encounter that building and that space? That, to me, is an incredibly important question. And I think what's becoming clear is that maybe there are much larger kind of psychological ramifications to that. That maybe people's responses to something that is ugly is in some way participates in a decision to make take a deviant step. And on the flip side, maybe there's something about a beautiful space that invites good behavior or joy or anything like that. That's to me what's so exciting about this this kind of work.
Hello. Thank you so much for being here. I've been looking forward to hearing you speak in Miami for a while. I wanted to follow up on this discussion. I remember hearing when I think Charles Montgomery was at the BMW Guggenheim lab that was traveling around from different cities. They ran an experiment where they had people stand on a block and look at the other side of the street. And there was either a street that had one giant building occupying the whole other side of the street, or like 5, 6, 10 little buildings. Mm-hmm. And they said, how engaged or how connected do you feel to this neighborhood based on what you're looking at? And the blocks with lots of little buildings, people felt more engaged with the neighborhood and connected with the community. And so I think it's that kind of data gathering and looking into the aspects of the built environment that can make people feel connected socially, or connected with the community or engaged. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, I would be curious to know what your peers in the room in the real estate development business think of the observation that many small buildings on one block are preferable to one large one. Yeah, no, that's super interesting. You know what also I'm reminded of? There is another sub-literature on one-way streets that one of the things that distinguishes crime hotspots is they do tend disproportionately to be on one-way streets. One-way streets are not a good idea from a number of different, they increase traffic efficiency at substantial cost to other things. So there are all kinds of little quirky factors that I feel like we need to be paying more attention to that can contribute to these kinds of positive or negative feelings.
Is coupling something that is only experienced at the human scale, or can you view it more at a macro level? For example, you saying that Baltimore has a higher crime rate than somewhere else.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is reasonable to assume that you should be able to see coupling at many different levels. You're raising a really interesting question, which is that is it possible that built environments on a citywide scale might have this kind of malign effect on populations? And that's super interesting, and I think also probably supportable. I mean, a lot of this, what's interesting about these discussions is that they take us back to urban planning perspectives and debates of a generation ago, where I feel like people were asking these questions, but they didn't give us good answers. In fact, they gave us bad answers. But I think maybe it's time to revisit some of those questions and try to come up with better answers. But the idea that that we know all we need to know about the consequences of how space is organized and built out is nonsense. This is virgin territory. And the crime concentration stuff, I cannot impress enough upon you how weird it is. Nobody in the entire world of criminology would have guessed that's what crime looked like. And for generations, police officers worked the streets of cities, and it never occurred to them this was going on. It just didn't make any sense. There was a big blind spot. So that kind of thing suggests to me that there's a lot of real weirdness out there waiting to be uncovered in your world.
So we're going to need to wrap up now. Okay. I'm going to get the last question in now because we've asked everybody today, and we're going to pose the same question to you. You've got students from all different backgrounds here, MBAs, real estate developments, construction, architecture, urban design. What advice do you have to them as they complete their studies and venture out into the world, into their careers?
Advice for, well, I mean, I suppose, I thought I just gave advice. I guess I can, I can give more. There's a limit to how much advice. Well, you know, so I guess, well, let me give advice to the university, since we are at a university function. What does this say about the way we ought to educate people looking to enter these professions? And I'm reminded of a study that I read a few months ago. That was, this is another digression. I have a cousin who is the editor of the leading scientific journal in the world of ophthalmology. That sounds very nerdy, and it is. And he assigned me to write this little editorial on a study in ophthalmology. And what they did was, you know, ophthalmologists are tasked with making, with reading, you know, they take pictures of the eye and they have to make sophisticated diagnoses on the basis of what they see. And what the study did is it took a group of medical students who were doing training, their specialty training in ophthalmology, and instead of giving them some portion of their instruction in the med school, it made them go down the street to the art museum, this is in Philadelphia, to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and to take a course in art appreciation, to learn where they were taught how to look at art. And then it took those kids who had been taught how to look at art, brought them back, and tested their diagnostic skills against their peers who had been taught entirely within the medical school. What did they discover? They discovered, as you can imagine, that the kids who had been sent to do art appreciation were vastly better diagnosticians than their peers who had instead spent all that time in the med school. What that tells us is that as the kind of problems that professionals are facing grow more complex, and the task of an ophthalmologist today is infinitely more complex than it was a generation ago. You're asking questions and answering questions that never occurred to the generation or two that came before you. As these problems grow more complex, the benefits of interdisciplinary preparation become greater. And so I think that when we work backwards from these kinds of observations, what we need to be saying is that if someone is to be a truly effective developer or architect or do anything in these professions, they need to have a broader perspective on society. They need to have people who have thought about and been trained in the humanities and have read literature and history and have just something that they can bring to their profession from the broader world that prepares them for these kinds of much more complex and consequential questions. How's that for advice? Thank you all. Bye-bye.